All or nothing thinking, also known as black and white thinking, is a cognitive distortion where individuals view situations, people, or themselves in extreme, polarized terms. Instead of seeing the nuances and complexities of life, everything is categorized as either perfect or a complete failure, with no middle ground. This type of thinking can have significant impacts on mental health, relationships, and overall well-being. It often leads to unrealistic expectations, heightened stress, and a distorted perception of reality. One of the most common areas where all or nothing thinking manifests is in self-evaluation. For example, someone might believe that if they don't achieve perfection in a task, they are a total failure. This mindset can be particularly damaging in academic or professional settings, where the pressure to perform is high. A student who receives a B on an exam might think, "I'm terrible at this subject," instead of recognizing the effort they put in and the progress they've made. This kind of thinking can lead to feelings of inadequacy, low self-esteem, and even burnout, as the individual constantly strives for an unattainable standard of perfection. In relationships, all or nothing thinking can create unnecessary conflict and dissatisfaction. For instance, if a partner forgets an important date, the other might conclude, "They don't care about me at all," rather than considering that it might have been an honest mistake or a result of a busy schedule. This kind of extreme interpretation can erode trust and communication, making it difficult to resolve conflicts constructively. It can also lead to a cycle of blame and resentment, as one or both partners feel unfairly judged or misunderstood. Another area where this cognitive distortion can be problematic is in goal setting and personal growth. People who engage in all or nothing thinking often set rigid, unrealistic goals for themselves. For example, someone trying to adopt a healthier lifestyle might decide to completely cut out all junk food and exercise for 2 hours every day. While these goals might seem admirable, they are often unsustainable. When the individual inevitably slips up, perhaps by eating a piece of cake or missing a workout, they might feel like they've failed entirely and give up on their efforts altogether. This all-or-nothing approach can prevent people from making gradual, sustainable changes that lead to long-term success. The roots of all-or-nothing thinking often lie in deeper psychological patterns, such as perfectionism, fear of failure, or low self-esteem. For some, this way of thinking may have developed as a coping mechanism in childhood, where they received praise only for perfect performance and criticism for anything less. Over time, this can create a mindset where anything short of perfection feels unacceptable. Additionally, societal pressures and cultural expectations can reinforce this binary way of thinking, as people are often encouraged to strive for extreme success and avoid failure at all costs. Breaking free from all-or-nothing thinking requires conscious effort and self-awareness. One effective strategy is to practice recognizing and challenging these thought patterns. When you catch yourself thinking in absolutes, such as, "I always mess up," or "this will never work," pause and ask yourself if this is truly accurate. Are there exceptions to this belief? Can you think of times when things turned out differently? This process of cognitive restructuring can help you develop a more balanced and realistic perspective. Another helpful approach is to embrace the concept of good enough. Instead of aiming for perfection, focus on progress and effort. Celebrate small victories and recognize that setbacks are a natural part of growth. For example, if you're working on a project and it doesn't turn out exactly as you envisioned, instead of labeling it a failure. Consider what you learned from the experience and how you can improve in the future. This shift in mindset can reduce the pressure you place on yourself and make it easier to persevere in the face of challenges. Mindfulness and self-compassion are also powerful tools for overcoming all-or-nothing thinking. Mindfulness encourages you to stay present and observe your thoughts without judgment, which can help you recognize when you're falling into extreme thinking patterns. Self-compassion involves treating yourself with kindness and understanding, especially when things don't go as planned. Instead of berating yourself for a mistake, remind yourself that everyone makes mistakes and that it's an opportunity to learn and grow. It's also important to seek support when needed. Talking to a trusted friend, family member, or therapist can provide valuable perspective and help you challenge your all-or-nothing thoughts. A therapist, in particular, can work with you to identify the underlying causes of this thinking pattern and develop strategies to address it. Cognitive behavioral therapy, CBT, for example, is a widely used approach that focuses on changing negative thought patterns and behaviors. In conclusion, all-or-nothing thinking is a common cognitive distortion that can have far-reaching effects on mental health, relationships, and personal growth. By recognizing this pattern and actively working to challenge it, you can develop a more balanced and realistic perspective. Embracing imperfection, practicing self-compassion, and seeking support when needed are all important steps in overcoming this mindset. Remember, life is rarely black and white. Most experiences exist in shades of gray, and learning to navigate this complexity can lead to greater resilience, satisfaction, and well-being. Overgeneralization is a cognitive distortion where individuals draw broad, sweeping conclusions based on a single event or limited evidence. It's like taking one negative experience and applying it to all similar situations, often leading to irrational beliefs and unnecessary emotional distress. For example, if someone fails at a task once, they might think, "I always fail at everything." Or if a relationship ends, they might conclude, "I'll never find love again." This kind of thinking can create a distorted view of reality, making challenges seem insurmountable and setbacks feel permanent. One of the key characteristics of overgeneralization is the use of absolute language, such as always, never, everyone, or no one. These words signal that the person is taking a specific incident and applying it universally. For instance, if someone is rejected after a job interview, they might think, "No one will ever hire me," even though this is just one rejection among many potential opportunities. This type of thinking can lead to feelings of hopelessness and helplessness, as it reinforces the belief that negative outcomes are inevitable and unchangeable. Overgeneralization often stems from underlying issues such as low self-esteem, anxiety, or past trauma. For example, someone who has experienced repeated failures or criticism in the past may be more prone to overgeneralizing because they've learned to expect negative outcomes. Similarly, individuals with anxiety may overgeneralize as a way to prepare for the worst, believing that if they anticipate failure or rejection, they'll be less hurt if it happens. However, this mindset can become a self-fulfilling prophecy, as the fear of failure or rejection may prevent them from taking risks or pursuing opportunities. This cognitive distortion can have a significant impact on mental health, Overgeneralization is closely linked to depression, as it reinforces negative beliefs about oneself, others, and the world. For example, someone who overgeneralizes might think, "I'm a failure, people always let me down," or "nothing ever goes right for me." These beliefs can lead to feelings of worthlessness, isolation, and despair. Over time, this pattern of thinking can contribute to a cycle of negativity, where the individual becomes increasingly focused on their perceived failures and ignores evidence to the contrary. Overgeneralization can also affect relationships. For instance, if someone has a disagreement with a friend, they might think, "Everyone always misunderstands me," or "I can't trust anyone." This kind of thinking can create distance and conflict, as it prevents the individual from seeing the nuances of the situation and working toward resolution. It can also lead to avoidance, as the person may start to withdraw from social interactions to protect themselves from perceived rejection or disappointment. In addition to its emotional and relational consequences, overgeneralization can hinder personal growth and problem solving. When someone believes that negative outcomes are inevitable, they may be less likely to take action or try new things. For example, if someone overgeneralizes their past failures in public speaking, they might avoid opportunities to present or share their ideas, even if it could benefit their career or personal development. This avoidance can limit their potential and reinforce their negative beliefs, creating a cycle of stagnation. To overcome overgeneralization, it's important to develop awareness of this thought pattern and challenge it when it arises. One effective strategy is to examine the evidence for and against the overgeneralized belief. For example, if you find yourself thinking, "I always mess up," ask yourself, "Is this really true? Can I think of times when I succeeded or did well?" This process of questioning can help you see that your belief is not based on reality, but on a distorted interpretation of events. Another helpful approach is to reframe your thoughts using more balanced and accurate language. Instead of saying, "I'll never get this right," you might say, "This is challenging, but I'm learning and improving." This shift in language can help you adopt a more constructive and hopeful mindset. It's also important to focus on specific situations rather than making broad generalizations. For example, instead of thinking, "Everyone always lets me down," you might reflect on the specific circumstances of a recent disappointment and consider whether it's fair to apply that experience to all relationships. Mindfulness can also be a valuable tool in addressing overgeneralization. By practicing mindfulness, you can learn to observe your thoughts without judgment and recognize when you're falling into overgeneralized thinking. This awareness can help you interrupt the pattern and choose a more balanced perspective. Additionally, self-compassion can play a key role in overcoming overgeneralization. Instead of being harsh and critical toward yourself, try to treat yourself with kindness and understanding, recognizing that everyone makes mistakes and experiences setbacks. Seeking support from others can also be beneficial. Talking to a trusted friend, family member, or therapist can provide a fresh perspective and help you challenge your overgeneralized beliefs. A therapist, in particular, can work with you to identify the underlying causes of this thinking pattern and develop strategies to address it. Cognitive behavioral therapy, CBT, for example, is a widely used approach that focuses on changing negative thought patterns and behaviors. In conclusion, Overgeneralization is a common cognitive distortion that can have a significant impact on mental health, relationships, and personal growth. By recognizing this pattern and actively working to challenge it, you can develop a more balanced and realistic perspective. Reframing your thoughts, practicing mindfulness, and seeking support when needed are all important steps in overcoming overgeneralization. Remember, one negative experience does not define your entire life, and learning to see the nuances in situations can help you build resilience and move forward with greater confidence and optimism. Mental filtering is a cognitive distortion where individuals focus exclusively on the negative aspects of a situation while ignoring or dismissing any positive elements. It's like looking at the world through a pair of glasses that only allow you to see what's wrong, while filtering out anything that's good or neutral. This skewed perspective can lead to a distorted view of reality, where challenges feel overwhelming and successes feel insignificant or non-existent. Over time, mental filtering can contribute to feelings of hopelessness, low self-esteem, and even depression. One of the key characteristics of mental filtering is its selective nature. For example, imagine someone receives feedback on a project at work. The feedback includes several positive comments about their creativity and effort, but also a few constructive criticisms. If this person engages in mental filtering, they might fixate entirely on the criticisms, thinking, "I did a terrible job," while completely overlooking the positive feedback. This selective focus can create a sense of failure, even when the overall picture is much more balanced or even positive. Mental filtering often stems from deeper psychological patterns, such as perfectionism or a tendency toward negative thinking. For individuals who struggle with perfectionism, anything less than flawless performance can feel like a failure, and they may dismiss any evidence of success as irrelevant. Similarly, people who have a predisposition toward negative thinking may find it easier to notice and dwell on what's wrong rather than what's right. This can create a self-reinforcing cycle, where the more they focus on the negative, the more they train their brain to seek out and amplify negative information. The impact of mental filtering on mental health can be significant. By consistently focusing on the negative, individuals may develop a pessimistic outlook on life, feeling as though nothing ever goes right for them. This can lead to feelings of helplessness and despair, as they begin to believe that their efforts are futile and that positive outcomes are out of reach. Over time, this mindset can contribute to the development or worsening of depression and anxiety, as the individual becomes increasingly trapped in a cycle of negativity. Mental filtering can also affect relationships. For instance, if someone has a disagreement with a friend or partner, they might focus solely on the conflict and ignore all the positive aspects of the relationship. They might think, "This person doesn't care about me," or "Our relationship is falling apart," without considering the many moments of connection, support, and joy they've shared. This skewed perspective can create unnecessary tension and conflict, as the individual may become overly critical or withdraw emotionally. In addition to its emotional and relational consequences, mental filtering can hinder personal growth and problem solving. When someone is constantly focused on what's wrong, they may struggle to see opportunities for improvement or feel motivated to take action. For example, if someone is working on a personal goal, such as improving their fitness, they might focus only on the days they missed a workout or didn't eat as healthily as they wanted, while ignoring the progress they've made overall. This can lead to feelings of discouragement and make it harder to stay committed to their goals. To overcome mental filtering, it's important to develop awareness of this thought pattern and actively work to challenge it. One effective strategy is to consciously shift your focus to include positive aspects of a situation. For example, if you catch yourself dwelling on a criticism or setback, take a moment to ask yourself, what went well? What can I be proud of? This doesn't mean ignoring the negative entirely, but rather balancing it with a more realistic and comprehensive view of the situation. Another helpful approach is to practice gratitude. By regularly reflecting on the things you're grateful for, you can train your brain to notice and appreciate the positive aspects of your life. This can help counteract the tendency to focus exclusively on the negative. For example, you might keep a gratitude journal where you write down 3 things you're thankful for each day. Over time, this practice can help you develop a more balanced and positive outlook. Mindfulness can also be a valuable tool in addressing mental filtering. By practicing mindfulness, you can learn to observe your thoughts without judgment and recognize when you're falling into the trap of focusing only on the negative. This awareness can help you interrupt the pattern and choose a more balanced perspective. Additionally, self-compassion can play a key role in overcoming mental filtering. Instead of being harsh and critical toward yourself, try to treat yourself with kindness and understanding, recognizing that no one is perfect and that it's okay to have both strengths and weaknesses. In conclusion, mental filtering is a common cognitive distortion that can have a significant impact on mental health, relationships, and personal growth. By recognizing this pattern and actively working to challenge it, you can develop a more balanced and realistic perspective. Shifting your focus to include positive aspects, practicing gratitude, and cultivating mindfulness are all important steps in overcoming mental filtering. Remember, life is a mix of positive and negative experiences, and learning to see the full picture can help you build resilience and move forward with greater confidence and optimism. Disqualifying the positive is a cognitive distortion where individuals dismiss or downplay positive experiences, achievements, or feedback, often attributing them to luck, external factors, or minimal significance. Instead of acknowledging and internalizing the good, they find ways to invalidate it, maintaining a negative or self-critical mindset. This pattern of thinking can prevent people from experiencing joy, building self-esteem, and recognizing their own worth, ultimately reinforcing feelings of inadequacy or failure. One of the most common ways disqualifying the positive manifests is in response to compliments or praise. For example, if someone receives a compliment on their work, they might think, "They're just being nice," or "It wasn't that good, I got lucky." By dismissing the compliment, they fail to internalize the positive feedback and instead reinforce a belief that they are not truly deserving of recognition. This can create a cycle where positive experiences are consistently minimized, leaving the individual feeling unappreciated or undervalued, even when others are trying to affirm them. This cognitive distortion often stems from underlying issues such as low self-esteem, perfectionism, or a fear of failure. For individuals with low self-esteem, accepting positive feedback or achievements can feel uncomfortable or even threatening, as it conflicts with their negative self-image. Similarly, perfectionists may disqualify the positive because they hold themselves to impossibly high standards, believing that anything less than perfection is unworthy of acknowledgement. This mindset can make it difficult to celebrate successes or feel satisfied with accomplishments, as the focus remains on what could have been better rather than what was achieved. Disqualifying the positive can also have a significant impact on mental health. By consistently dismissing positive experiences, individuals may develop a pessimistic outlook on life, feeling as though they are incapable of success or happiness. This can contribute to feelings of hopelessness, depression, and anxiety, as the individual becomes increasingly focused on their perceived shortcomings and failures. Over time, this pattern of thinking can erode self-confidence and make it harder to take risks or pursue goals, as the belief that positive outcomes are unattainable becomes deeply ingrained. In relationships, disqualifying the positive can create barriers to connection and intimacy. For example, if a partner expresses love or appreciation, someone who disqualifies the positive might think, "They don't really mean it," or "They're just saying that to make me feel better." This can lead to feelings of mistrust or insecurity, as the individual struggles to accept and believe in the positive intentions of others. Over time, this can create distance and strain in relationships, as the other person may feel unappreciated or misunderstood. To overcome disqualifying the positive, it's important to develop awareness of this thought pattern and actively work to challenge it. One effective strategy is to pause and reflect when you catch yourself dismissing a positive experience or compliment. Ask yourself, why am I minimizing this? What evidence supports the idea that this is genuinely positive? By consciously examining your thoughts, you can begin to recognize and counteract the tendency to disqualify the positive. Another helpful approach is to practice self-compassion and self-acceptance. Instead of being overly critical or dismissive of your achievements, try to treat yourself with the same kindness and understanding you would offer a friend. For example, if you accomplish a goal, take a moment to acknowledge your effort and celebrate your success, rather than focusing on what could have been better. This shift in mindset can help you internalize positive experiences and build a healthier sense of self-worth. Mindfulness can also be a valuable tool in addressing disqualifying the positive. By practicing mindfulness, you can learn to observe your thoughts without judgment and recognize when you're falling into the trap of dismissing the good. This awareness can help you interrupt the pattern and choose a more balanced perspective. Additionally, keeping a journal of positive experiences or achievements can help you train your brain to notice and appreciate the good in your life, rather than automatically discounting it. In conclusion, disqualifying the positive is a cognitive distortion that can have a significant impact on mental health, relationships, and self-esteem. By recognizing this pattern and actively working to challenge it, you can develop a more balanced and realistic perspective. Practicing self-compassion, mindfulness, and gratitude are all important steps in overcoming this mindset. Remember, positive experiences and achievements are valid and deserving of acknowledgement, and learning to embrace them can help you build resilience, confidence, and a greater sense of fulfillment in life. Jumping to conclusions is a cognitive distortion where individuals make negative assumptions or predictions about a situation without sufficient evidence. This often involves two specific patterns: mind reading and fortune telling. Mind reading is assuming you know what others are thinking, usually in a negative way, while fortune telling is predicting that things will turn out badly, often without any factual basis. This type of thinking can lead to unnecessary stress, misunderstandings, and missed opportunities, as it creates a distorted view of reality based on assumptions rather than facts. One of the most common examples of jumping to conclusions is mind reading. For instance, if a friend doesn't respond to a text message right away, someone who jumps to conclusions might think, "They're ignoring me because they're mad at me," or "They don't care about me anymore." In reality, the friend might be busy, distracted, or simply haven't seen the message yet. By assuming the worst, the individual creates unnecessary anxiety and may even act on these assumptions, potentially damaging the relationship. This pattern of thinking can lead to misunderstandings and conflict, as the person may withdraw or react defensively based on their unfounded beliefs. Fortune telling, on the other hand, involves predicting negative outcomes without evidence. For example, someone might think, "I'm going to fail this exam no matter how much I study," or "I'll never find a job I love." These predictions are often based on fear or past experiences rather than the current situation. By assuming the worst, the individual may feel discouraged or paralyzed, leading to self-sabotage or avoidance of opportunities. This can create a self-fulfilling prophecy, where the negative outcome becomes more likely because the person didn't take action or put in the effort needed to succeed. Jumping to conclusions often stems from underlying issues such as anxiety, low self-esteem, or past experiences of rejection or failure. For individuals with anxiety, this cognitive distortion can be a way of trying to prepare for the worst, as they believe that anticipating negative outcomes will help them avoid disappointment or hurt. However, this mindset often backfires, as it creates unnecessary stress and prevents the person from fully engaging in the present moment. Similarly, those with low self-esteem may jump to negative conclusions because they doubt their abilities or worth, assuming that others view them negatively or that they are destined to fail. The impact of jumping to conclusions on mental health can be significant. By consistently assuming the worst, individuals may develop a pessimistic outlook on life, feeling as though they have little control over their circumstances. This can contribute to feelings of helplessness, depression, and anxiety, as the person becomes trapped in a cycle of negative thinking. Over time, this pattern can erode self-confidence and make it harder to take risks or pursue goals, as the fear of failure or rejection becomes overwhelming. In relationships, jumping to conclusions can create unnecessary tension and conflict. For example, if a partner seems quieter than usual, someone who jumps to conclusions might assume, "They're upset with me," or "They're losing interest in the relationship." These assumptions can lead to misunderstandings and arguments, as the person may act on their beliefs without seeking clarification. This can create distance and strain in the relationship, as the other person may feel unfairly judged or misunderstood. To overcome jumping to conclusions, it's important to develop awareness of this thought pattern and actively work to challenge it. One effective strategy is to pause and ask yourself, what evidence do I have to support this assumption? For example, if you find yourself thinking, "They're ignoring me," consider alternative explanations, such as the person being busy or distracted. By examining the facts, rather than relying on assumptions, you can develop a more balanced and realistic perspective. Another helpful approach is to practice mindfulness and stay present. Jumping to conclusions often involves projecting into the future or interpreting others' thoughts, which takes you out of the present moment. By practicing mindfulness, you can learn to observe your thoughts without judgment and focus on what is actually happening, rather than what you assume might happen. This can help you interrupt the pattern of jumping to conclusions and choose a more grounded and rational response. It's also important to communicate openly and seek clarification when needed. Instead of assuming you know what someone is thinking or feeling, ask them directly. For example, if you're worried that a friend is upset with you, you might say, "I noticed you haven't responded to my message. Is everything okay?" This can help you avoid misunderstandings and build stronger, more trusting relationships. In conclusion, jumping to conclusions is a common cognitive distortion that can have a significant impact on mental health, relationships, and decision-making. By recognizing this pattern and actively working to challenge it, you can develop a more balanced and realistic perspective. Practicing mindfulness, seeking evidence, and communicating openly are all important steps in overcoming this mindset. Remember, assumptions are not facts, and learning to question your thoughts can help you build resilience, reduce stress, and make more informed choices in life. Catastrophizing is a cognitive distortion where individuals imagine and focus on the worst possible outcome of a situation, often blowing it out of proportion. It's like taking a small problem and turning it into a full-blown disaster in your mind. This type of thinking can lead to intense anxiety, stress, and a sense of helplessness as the person becomes overwhelmed by their own exaggerated predictions. Catastrophizing often starts with a minor concern, but through a series of what-if thoughts, it spirals into a scenario of doom and gloom. One of the key characteristics of catastrophizing is its tendency to escalate quickly. For example, imagine someone makes a small mistake at work, like sending an email with a typo. Instead of simply correcting the error and moving on, they might think, "What if my boss notices and thinks I'm careless? What if this ruins my reputation? What if I get fired? What if I can't find another job and end up losing everything?" This chain of thoughts transforms a minor issue into a life-altering catastrophe, even though there's no evidence to support these extreme outcomes. This kind of thinking can be exhausting and paralyzing as the person becomes consumed by fear and worry. Catastrophizing often stems from underlying issues such as anxiety, perfectionism, or a history of trauma. For individuals with anxiety, catastrophizing can be a way of trying to prepare for the worst, as they believe that anticipating disaster will help them avoid it. However, this mindset often backfires, as it creates unnecessary stress and prevents the person from focusing on solutions or taking constructive action. Similarly, perfectionists may catastrophize because they fear failure or making mistakes, leading them to imagine the worst-case scenario as a way of motivating themselves to avoid it. Unfortunately, this approach often leads to burnout and increased anxiety. The impact of catastrophizing on mental health can be significant. By constantly imagining the worst, individuals may develop a sense of helplessness and hopelessness, feeling as though they have no control over their circumstances. This can contribute to feelings of depression and anxiety, as the person becomes trapped in a cycle of negative thinking. Over time, this pattern can erode self-confidence and make it harder to take risks or pursue goals, as the fear of failure or disaster becomes overwhelming. Catastrophizing can also affect relationships. For example, if a partner is late coming home, someone who catastrophizes might think, what if they got into an accident? What if something terrible happened to them? These thoughts can lead to intense worry and panic, even though there's no evidence to support them. While it's natural to feel concerned for a loved one, catastrophizing can create unnecessary stress and strain in relationships, as the person may become overly anxious or controlling in an attempt to prevent their imagined disasters. In addition to its emotional and relational consequences, catastrophizing can hinder problem-solving and decision-making. When someone is consumed by thoughts of the worst-case scenario, they may struggle to see alternative solutions or take constructive action. For example, if someone is worried about a potential health issue, they might avoid going to the doctor out of fear of bad news, even though early detection and treatment could be beneficial. This avoidance can make the situation worse, as the person remains stuck in a cycle of fear and inaction. To overcome catastrophizing, it's important to develop awareness of this thought pattern and actively work to challenge it. One effective strategy is to pause and ask yourself, what's the worst that could realistically happen? Often, when you examine the situation more closely, you'll find that the worst-case scenario is unlikely or not as catastrophic as it seems. For example, if you're worried about making a mistake at work, remind yourself that mistakes are a normal part of learning and growth, and that most errors can be corrected without major consequences. Another helpful approach is to practice grounding techniques to bring yourself back to the present moment. Catastrophizing often involves projecting into the future, which can make the problem feel larger and more overwhelming than it actually is. By focusing on the present, you can interrupt the spiral of negative thoughts and regain a sense of control. For example, you might take a few deep breaths, notice your surroundings, or engage in a calming activity like journaling or meditation. It's also important to challenge your what-if thoughts with evidence-based reasoning. For example, if you find yourself thinking, what if I fail this exam and ruin my future? Ask yourself, what evidence do I have that this will happen? Have I prepared as best as I can? What steps can I take to improve my chances of success? By focusing on facts and solutions rather than fears, you can develop a more balanced and realistic perspective. In conclusion, catastrophizing is a common cognitive distortion that can have a significant impact on mental health, relationships, and decision-making. By recognizing this pattern and actively working to challenge it, you can develop a more balanced and realistic perspective. Practicing grounding techniques, questioning your what-if thoughts, and focusing on solutions are all important steps in overcoming catastrophizing. Remember, while it's natural to worry about the future, most of the disasters we imagine never come to pass, and learning to manage your thoughts can help you build resilience and reduce unnecessary stress. Emotional reasoning is a cognitive distortion where individuals believe that their emotions reflect objective reality. In other words, if they feel a certain way, they assume it must be true, regardless of the actual evidence. For example, someone might think, I feel like a failure, so I must be a failure. Or, I feel anxious about this situation, so it must be dangerous. This type of thinking can create a distorted view of reality, as emotions, while valid and important, are not always accurate indicators of the truth. Emotional reasoning can lead to unnecessary stress, self-doubt, and poor decision-making, as it prioritizes feelings over facts. One of the key characteristics of emotional reasoning is its reliance on emotions as evidence. For instance, imagine someone is preparing for a presentation at work. They feel nervous and think, "I'm so anxious about this, I must not be ready, and I'm going to mess it up." In reality, their anxiety might be due to normal pre-presentation jitters or past experiences, not an accurate reflection of their preparedness or ability. By equating their anxiety with a lack of readiness, they may undermine their confidence and overlook the effort they've put into preparing. This can create a self-fulfilling prophecy, where the person's belief in their impending failure leads to poor performance. Emotional reasoning often stems from underlying issues such as low self-esteem, anxiety, or past trauma. For individuals with low self-esteem, negative emotions like self-doubt or shame can feel like undeniable truths, reinforcing a negative self-image. Similarly, people with anxiety may use emotional reasoning to justify their fears, believing that their feelings of dread or panic are proof that something bad is about to happen. This can create a cycle of fear and avoidance, as the person becomes increasingly reliant on their emotions to guide their actions, even when those emotions are not grounded in reality. The impact of emotional reasoning on mental health can be significant. By conflating emotions with facts, individuals may develop a distorted view of themselves and the world around them. For example, someone who feels unlovable might believe that no one cares about them, even when there is ample evidence to the contrary. This can lead to feelings of isolation, depression, and hopelessness as the person becomes trapped in a cycle of negative thinking. Over time, this pattern can erode self-confidence and make it harder to take risks or pursue goals, as the fear of failure or rejection becomes overwhelming. Emotional reasoning can also affect relationships. For instance, if someone feels hurt or upset after a disagreement with a friend, they might think, "They must not care about me," or "This friendship is over." These thoughts are based on emotions rather than facts, and they can lead to misunderstandings and conflict. Instead of addressing the issue directly, the person may withdraw or act on their feelings, potentially damaging the relationship. This can create distance and strain, as the other person may feel unfairly judged or misunderstood. In addition to its emotional and relational consequences, emotional reasoning can hinder problem-solving and decision-making. When someone relies on their emotions to guide their actions, they may overlook important information or make choices that are not in their best interest. For example, if someone feels overwhelmed by a task, they might avoid it altogether, even though completing it could lead to positive outcomes. This avoidance can create additional stress and make it harder to achieve goals, as the person remains stuck in a cycle of fear and inaction. To overcome emotional reasoning, it's important to develop awareness of this thought pattern and actively work to challenge it. One effective strategy is to separate your emotions from the facts. For example, if you find yourself thinking, "I feel like a failure, so I must be a failure," ask yourself, what evidence do I have to support this belief? Are there examples of times when I succeeded or did well? By examining the facts, you can develop a more balanced and realistic perspective. Another helpful approach is to practice mindfulness and self-compassion. Mindfulness encourages you to observe your emotions without judgment, recognizing that they are temporary and not necessarily reflective of reality. Self-compassion involves treating yourself with kindness and understanding, even when you're feeling negative emotions. For example, instead of berating yourself for feeling anxious, you might say, "It's okay to feel this way. Anxiety is a normal emotion, and it doesn't define me or my abilities." It's also important to challenge your emotional reasoning by seeking alternative perspectives. For example, if you're feeling upset after a disagreement, try to consider the other person's point of view, or talk to a trusted friend for their input. This can help you gain a more balanced understanding of the situation and reduce the intensity of your emotions. Additionally, keeping a journal can be a helpful tool for identifying patterns in your emotional reasoning and tracking your progress in challenging these thoughts. In conclusion, emotional reasoning is a common cognitive distortion that can have a significant impact on mental health, relationships, and decision-making. By recognizing this pattern and actively working to challenge it, you can develop a more balanced and realistic perspective. Separating emotions from facts, practicing mindfulness, and seeking alternative perspectives are all important steps in overcoming emotional reasoning. Remember, while emotions are valid and important, they are not always accurate indicators of reality. And learning to manage your thoughts can help you build resilience and make more informed choices in life. Should statements are a cognitive distortion where individuals impose rigid, often unrealistic expectations on themselves or others. These statements are characterized by the use of words like should, must, ought to, or have to, and they often reflect a sense of obligation or pressure. For example, someone might think, "I should be able to handle everything perfectly," or "they should know how I feel without me telling them." While these statements may seem motivating on the surface, they often lead to feelings of guilt, frustration, and inadequacy when the expectations are not met. Should statements can create a cycle of self-criticism and disappointment, as they set standards that are often impossible to achieve. One of the key characteristics of should statements is their inflexibility. They leave little room for error, nuance, or individual differences. For instance, someone might think, "I should always be productive," or "I should never make mistakes." These statements ignore the fact that being human means having limitations, experiencing setbacks, and needing rest. When these rigid expectations are not met, the individual may feel like a failure, even if they've accomplished a lot or made significant progress. This can lead to a cycle of self-criticism, where the person constantly feels like they're falling short of their own standards. Should statements often stem from underlying issues such as perfectionism, societal pressures, or a desire for control. For individuals with perfectionist tendencies, should statements can be a way of trying to maintain high standards and avoid failure. However, this mindset often backfires, as the pressure to meet these unrealistic expectations can lead to burnout, anxiety, and a sense of never being good enough. Similarly, societal or cultural expectations can contribute to should statements, as people may feel pressured to conform to certain norms or roles, even if they don't align with their own values or desires. The impact of should statements on mental health can be significant. By constantly focusing on what they should be doing or how they should be feeling, individuals may develop a sense of guilt, shame, or inadequacy. This can contribute to feelings of depression and anxiety, as the person becomes trapped in a cycle of self-criticism and disappointment. Over time, this pattern can erode self-esteem and make it harder to take risks or pursue goals, as the fear of not meeting expectations becomes overwhelming. Should statements can also affect relationships. For example, if someone thinks, "My partner should always know what I need," they may feel frustrated or resentful when their partner doesn't meet this expectation. This can create tension and conflict, as the person may blame their partner for not living up to their standards, rather than communicating their needs directly. Similarly, should statements directed at others, such as, "They should be more responsible," can lead to judgment and criticism, damaging trust and connection. In addition to their emotional and relational consequences, should statements can hinder personal growth and problem solving. When someone is focused on what they should be doing, they may struggle to accept their current reality or take constructive action. For example, if someone thinks, "I should be further along in my career by now," they may feel stuck or discouraged, rather than focusing on the steps they can take to move forward. This mindset can prevent them from setting realistic goals and celebrating their progress. To overcome should statements, it's important to develop awareness of this thought pattern and actively work to challenge it. One effective strategy is to replace should statements with more flexible and compassionate language. For example, instead of thinking, "I should be able to handle everything perfectly," you might say, "I'm doing the best I can, and that's enough." This shift in language can help you develop a more realistic and forgiving perspective, reducing the pressure you place on yourself. Another helpful approach is to examine the underlying beliefs behind your should statements. Ask yourself, where is this expectation coming from? Is it based on my own values, or is it influenced by external pressures? By identifying the source of these expectations, you can determine whether they are truly important to you or if they are unrealistic or unnecessary. This can help you let go of standards that don't serve you and focus on what truly matters. Mindfulness can also be a valuable tool in addressing should statements. By practicing mindfulness, you can learn to observe your thoughts without judgment and recognize when you're falling into the trap of rigid expectations. This awareness can help you interrupt the pattern and choose a more balanced perspective. Additionally, self-compassion can play a key role in overcoming should statements. Instead of being harsh and critical toward yourself, try to treat yourself with kindness and understanding, recognizing that no one is perfect and that it's okay to have limitations. In conclusion, should statements are a common cognitive distortion that can have a significant impact on mental health, relationships, and personal growth. By recognizing this pattern and actively working to challenge it, you can develop a more balanced and realistic perspective. Replacing should statements with flexible and compassionate language, examining underlying beliefs, and practicing mindfulness are all important steps in overcoming this mindset. Remember, life is full of complexities and imperfections, and learning to let go of rigid expectations can help you build resilience, reduce stress, and embrace a more fulfilling and authentic way of living. Labeling is a cognitive distortion in which a single mistake or negative experience is transformed into a fixed, global judgment about oneself or another person. It involves taking one specific incident and using it to define an entire character or identity, such as declaring, "I failed this test, so I am a complete failure," or calling someone lazy because they missed one deadline. This oversimplified way of thinking ignores the complexity of human behavior and reduces individuals to one-dimensional stereotypes, leaving little room for the nuances that define us as multifaceted beings. When we label ourselves, we create a self-fulfilling prophecy. Negative labels, once internalized, can dominate our self-concept and shape our future actions. For example, if someone repeatedly tells themselves that they are incompetent after a minor error, they begin to see every future challenge through that distorted lens. This constant reinforcement of negative self-beliefs not only decreases self-esteem, but can also lead to chronic stress, anxiety, and even depression. The more we accept these rigid labels, the more difficult it becomes to see our potential for growth or to acknowledge moments of success that contradict the label. Labeling also affects how we perceive and interact with others. When we quickly assign a negative label to someone based on a single behavior, like deeming a coworker irresponsible because they were late once, we ignore the broader context of that person's life and character. This tendency to generalize can lead to miscommunications and strained relationships. It prevents us from appreciating that people can be both capable and fallible. A person might be late on occasion, but also demonstrate reliability and dedication in other aspects of their work or personal life. The danger of labeling lies in its permanence. Once a label is established, it tends to stick, coloring future interactions and judgments. Instead of recognizing that people are capable of change and that a single error does not define their entire identity, labeling traps them in a narrow, unyielding narrative. This narrow view can inhibit personal development and limit opportunities, as both the labeled individual and those around them begin to expect failure or negative behavior based solely on that initial judgment. Overcoming the habit of labeling requires mindfulness and conscious effort to challenge our automatic thoughts. One effective approach is to focus on describing specific behaviors rather than assigning global labels. Instead of saying, "I am a failure," it is more constructive to acknowledge, "I made a mistake on this test, and I can learn from it to improve next time." This subtle shift in language helps us separate the action from our identity, opening the door to growth and learning rather than self-condemnation. Another useful strategy is to consider the broader context before making a judgment about ourselves or others. Recognizing that a single incident is rarely representative of the whole person encourages us to look for evidence of competence, kindness, or resilience that may contradict our initial negative label. By taking a moment to reflect on the full range of behaviors and circumstances, we can develop a more balanced and compassionate understanding. In our relationships, avoiding labeling means practicing empathy and open communication. When we catch ourselves about to assign a fixed label to someone, pausing to ask what else might be going on can lead to more productive conversations and a deeper understanding of that person's actions. This practice not only benefits the person being labeled, but also enriches our own interpersonal experiences, making it easier to build trust and mutual respect. Ultimately, overcoming labeling is about embracing the complexity of human nature. It involves recognizing that every person has strengths and weaknesses, and that our worth cannot be reduced to a single trait or mistake. By rejecting rigid labels and adopting a more nuanced perspective, we open ourselves to a richer, more flexible view of the world, one that values growth, learning, and the ever-changing nature of our experiences. In essence, labeling may seem like a harmless shortcut for understanding ourselves and others, but its long-term effects can be profoundly damaging. By challenging these oversimplified judgments and replacing them with balanced, thoughtful evaluations, we empower ourselves to break free from negative cycles of thought. This not only enhances our own mental well-being, but also fosters healthier, more supportive relationships in every area of life. Personalization is a cognitive distortion in which you assume excessive personal responsibility for events outside of your control, or interpret situations as if they were specifically directed at you, even when they are not. This way of thinking leads you to believe that everything others do or say is a reflection of your own actions or worth, often resulting in undue guilt and self-blame. Imagine a situation at work where a project doesn't go as planned. Instead of recognizing that many factors contributed to the outcome, you might immediately think, "This is all my fault. I must have made a mistake," even when other variables, such as tight deadlines or team challenges, played a role. In such cases, you internalize the blame, absorbing the entire burden of the situation. When you personalize, you often analyze every detail of your actions and search for ways in which you might have caused a negative outcome. This can lead to a constant state of self-scrutiny, where even minor missteps are magnified into proof of your inherent inadequacy. The more you fixate on these self-attributions, the more you reinforce a negative self-image. For example, if a friend seems distracted during a conversation, you might immediately assume it's because you said something wrong or that they are upset with you, even though there could be countless other reasons for their behavior, such as a busy day or personal concerns that have nothing to do with you. This distortion often stems from deep-seated beliefs about your own value or competence. Past experiences, such as receiving criticism during formative years or internalizing negative messages about your abilities, can make you more likely to take things personally. When you believe that your worth is dependent on flawless performance or constant approval from others, even the smallest setback can feel like a confirmation of your perceived shortcomings. Over time, this habit of personalization can lead to chronic anxiety, persistent feelings of inadequacy, and even depression, as you constantly carry the weight of self-imposed responsibility. Personalization not only affects your internal emotional landscape, but also influences how you relate to others. When you assume that others' actions are always a reaction to you, you might misinterpret a co-worker's stress as a sign of personal failure, or believe that a loved one's bad mood is a direct result of something you did. This can lead to unnecessary apologies, a tendency to withdraw from relationships, or even overcompensation in social interactions. The outcome is that relationships can become strained because you are operating under the false assumption that you are the root cause of other people's difficulties, rather than recognizing that everyone has their own set of challenges and stressors. In daily life, the tendency to personalize can create a self-fulfilling cycle. If you constantly believe that you are at fault for everything that goes wrong, you might begin to avoid taking on new challenges or opportunities, fearing inevitable failure. This avoidance further limits your personal and professional growth as you become trapped in a cycle of self-doubt and inactivity. The more you let personalization dictate your thoughts, the less likely you are to see situations objectively, making it difficult to recognize and celebrate successes that contradict your negative self-view. One way to counter the effects of personalization is to pause and reflect on the situation from a broader perspective. When something goes awry, instead of immediately blaming yourself, take a moment to consider all the contributing factors. Ask yourself questions like, what else might have influenced this outcome? Or, could there be external reasons that I'm overlooking? By widening your focus, you begin to see that most situations are the result of a mix of variables, rather than solely your actions. Another helpful approach is to practice mindfulness, taking time to observe your thoughts without immediately accepting them as absolute truth. When you notice a thought like, "It's all my fault," try to examine it objectively. Remind yourself that people have their own lives and problems, and that it is unrealistic to assume complete responsibility for every negative event. This shift in perspective can help reduce the intensity of self-blame and open the door to a more balanced view of yourself and your interactions with the world. In relationships, clear communication can also play a key role in mitigating personalization. Instead of assuming that a friend's or colleague's behavior is a reaction to you, consider seeking clarification. Often, a simple conversation can reveal that their mood or actions are influenced by factors completely unrelated to you. By engaging in open dialogue, you not only ease your own worries, but also build a more accurate understanding of the situation, fostering healthier interactions. Ultimately, overcoming personalization involves recognizing that while you may play a part in many events, you are rarely the sole cause. Accepting that not everything is a personal commentary on your worth allows you to break free from the cycle of self-blame. By challenging the urge to internalize every negative outcome, you can begin to build a more realistic and forgiving view of yourself. This shift in mindset not only eases emotional distress, but also encourages a greater sense of empowerment as you learn to appreciate that life's challenges are multifaceted and that your value is not determined by any single moment or mistake. Confirmation bias is a cognitive tendency where we favor information that confirms our pre-existing beliefs while disregarding or minimizing evidence that contradicts them. In everyday life, this bias shapes the way we seek, interpret, and recall information, reinforcing our existing opinions and often leading to a distorted view of reality. For instance, imagine you have a strong belief about a particular political issue. You might actively search for news articles, social media posts, and opinions that support your viewpoint while ignoring alternative perspectives. This selective attention not only strengthens your original belief, but also makes it harder to change your mind, even in the face of compelling contradictory evidence. At its core, confirmation bias is about the comfort of familiarity and the avoidance of cognitive dissonance, the uncomfortable feeling that arises when new information conflicts with what we already believe. When you come across evidence that aligns with your views, it validates your way of thinking and provides a sense of certainty and security. On the other hand, conflicting evidence may challenge your identity or self-concept, making you more likely to dismiss or rationalize it away. This tendency is not limited to personal beliefs. It can influence how we form opinions about social groups, scientific theories, or even our own abilities. In everyday interactions, confirmation bias can manifest in various subtle ways. For example, when discussing a controversial topic with friends or colleagues, you might remember only the points that back up your arguments, while forgetting the valid criticisms that were raised. Over time, this can lead to more polarized views, where people become entrenched in their positions and less open to dialogue. In academic and professional settings, the bias might lead researchers to design studies or interpret data in a way that favors their hypotheses, sometimes overlooking results that could offer a more balanced or accurate understanding. The implications of confirmation bias are far-reaching. On an individual level, it can limit personal growth by creating a closed loop where new ideas or constructive criticism are automatically discounted. This means that learning and innovation can be stifled because you're less likely to explore ideas that challenge your existing mindset. In the realm of public discourse, confirmation bias contributes to echo chambers, where communities, often online, reinforce shared beliefs without encountering meaningful opposition. This phenomenon is evident in the way social media algorithms tend to show users content that mirrors their previous engagements, further isolating them from diverse perspectives. Another example can be seen in the way people handle relationships. If you hold a negative belief about someone, confirmation bias might lead you to interpret their actions in a way that confirms your negative view, even if there are benign explanations available. Over time, this skewed interpretation can damage relationships by creating misunderstandings and unnecessary conflicts, as the person becomes defined by a single characteristic or behavior rather than seen as a multifaceted individual. Moreover, confirmation bias plays a significant role in decision-making processes. In business, for instance, managers might rely too heavily on data that supports their strategies, overlooking warning signs or dissenting opinions that could indicate potential risks. Similarly, in personal finance, investors might focus on information that promises high returns while ignoring indicators of market instability, potentially leading to misguided investment decisions. One key challenge with confirmation bias is that it often operates at a subconscious level. You might not even be aware that you're selectively processing information to support your preconceptions. This invisibility makes it particularly insidious because the more you rely on this bias, the more your beliefs become reinforced, creating a cycle that is self-perpetuating. Breaking this cycle requires a deliberate effort to seek out diverse viewpoints and critically evaluate information from multiple sources. Overcoming confirmation bias involves cultivating an open mindset and a willingness to challenge your own assumptions. When encountering new information, it can be helpful to ask yourself whether you're giving it fair consideration, or if you're subconsciously dismissing it simply because it conflicts with what you already believe. A useful practice might be to actively look for reputable sources that offer differing perspectives, thereby broadening your understanding of an issue. Over time, this approach can help mitigate the effects of confirmation bias by encouraging a more balanced and nuanced view of the world. In summary, confirmation bias is a pervasive cognitive distortion that influences how we process information, form beliefs, and make decisions. By favoring evidence that confirms our existing views and ignoring contrary data, we risk developing an incomplete or skewed understanding of reality. Recognizing the presence of confirmation bias in our thinking is the first step toward countering its effects, allowing us to make more informed decisions, engage more thoughtfully with others, and embrace the complexity of the world around us. The availability heuristic is a mental shortcut that leads us to judge the likelihood of events based on how easily examples come to mind. When we think about how often something happens, we don't actually calculate probabilities. Instead, we recall instances from our memory, and the more vivid or recent those examples are, the more common we believe the event must be. For example, if you recently saw news reports of a plane crash, you might overestimate the risk of air travel, even though flying is statistically very safe. This is because dramatic and emotionally charged events are more memorable, making them seem more frequent than they really are. In everyday life, this shortcut influences our decisions and opinions in subtle ways. Imagine you're planning a vacation, and you've recently heard several stories about burglaries in tourist areas. Even if the actual crime statistics are low, the ease with which these stories pop into your head might lead you to choose a different destination or to take extra security measures. The availability heuristic essentially tells your brain, "This is important because I remember it well," even if the memory is skewed by factors such as media coverage or personal bias. This bias isn't just about assessing risks, it also affects our broader worldview. When the media repeatedly covers dramatic incidents like natural disasters or violent crimes, those events become readily available in our minds. Over time, this can lead to a distorted perception of reality, where rare events appear to be common. For instance, after several high-profile cases of terrorism, someone might start to believe that such events occur frequently, despite evidence showing they are, in fact, relatively rare. The availability heuristic thus plays a key role in shaping public opinion and even influencing policy decisions, as decision-makers might overemphasize risks that seem more immediate due to their prominence in public discourse. The influence of the availability heuristic can also be seen in how we evaluate our personal experiences. If you've had a few negative encounters in a particular context, say dealing with customer service, you might come to believe that all interactions in that domain will be poor, even if the majority are positive. Because the negative experiences stand out in your memory, they disproportionately color your overall impression. In this way, the availability heuristic not only distorts our perception of larger trends, but can also impact our day-to-day judgments and decisions, sometimes to our own detriment. One of the interesting aspects of this cognitive shortcut is that it operates largely outside our conscious awareness. We often don't realize that the ease with which an example comes to mind is influencing our judgment. This can make the availability heuristic particularly insidious, as it reinforces itself without us even noticing. When we continuously rely on easily recalled examples, we risk falling into a cycle where our beliefs become more extreme, simply because we're repeatedly exposed to certain types of information. For example, consider the way social media platforms curate content. Algorithms tend to show us information similar to what we've interacted with before. This means that if you often engage with content that highlights rare but dramatic events, your feed will be filled with similar stories. The more you see these stories, the more readily they come to mind, further reinforcing the belief that these events are common. In this way, the availability heuristic can contribute to the formation of echo chambers, where our pre-existing views are constantly validated, making us less open to alternative perspectives. The availability heuristic also affects how we assess personal risks. Many people might overestimate the chance of being involved in a car accident or falling victim to a rare illness simply because they have heard a compelling story about someone experiencing that event. Even if the statistical likelihood is very low, the personal impact of that story can lead you to behave more cautiously, sometimes excessively so. This can influence everything from insurance decisions to everyday travel habits, as the vividness of certain events overshadows the actual probabilities involved. Ultimately, while the availability heuristic is a natural and efficient mental shortcut, it saves us time and cognitive energy. It can lead to systematic errors in our thinking. Recognizing that our judgments are often based on the ease of recall rather than on hard data is the first step toward mitigating its effects. By making a conscious effort to consider broader statistics or seek out more balanced information, we can start to correct the distortions in our perceptions. This awareness is essential for making more informed decisions in both our personal lives and in the broader context of societal issues. In summary, the availability heuristic influences us by causing us to overestimate the frequency or likelihood of events that are more memorable, often due to their emotional impact or recent occurrence. This bias can distort our perception of risks, shape our opinions, and even influence public policy, all while operating mostly below the level of our conscious awareness. Being mindful of this tendency allows us to step back and evaluate situations more objectively, ensuring that our decisions are based on a fuller understanding of reality rather than on the most vivid examples that happen to come to mind. Anchoring bias is a cognitive shortcut in which we rely too heavily on the first piece of information we encounter, our anchor, when making decisions or estimates. This initial number, opinion, or piece of data sets the stage for all subsequent judgments, even if it's arbitrary or irrelevant. For instance, when you see a product's original price before a discount is applied, that initial figure can influence your perception of the sale, making the discount seem more substantial than it might be in absolute terms. When making decisions, our minds naturally latch onto the anchor and adjust from it, but often not sufficiently. This means that even if later information suggests a different value, our judgments tend to remain skewed toward that first number. This effect was famously demonstrated by Tversky and Kahneman in their groundbreaking research, where they showed that people's estimates for quantities or prices could be significantly influenced by a randomly provided anchor. The anchoring effect is particularly powerful because it operates largely outside our conscious awareness. We might not realize that the initial information is biasing our thinking. In negotiations, for example, if the first offer is high, subsequent counteroffers are likely to be higher than if the initial offer had been lower, even if both parties would have reached a similar agreement without the influence of the starting point. This happens because the anchor serves as a reference point, and our brains adjust our judgments relative to it, even if that adjustment is insufficient. In everyday life, anchoring bias can manifest in many contexts. When shopping, the first price you see for a product can become a benchmark, influencing whether you perceive subsequent prices as fair or overpriced. Similarly, in the realm of job negotiations, the first salary figure mentioned can shape the entire discussion, often anchoring expectations on both sides. Even when making personal decisions, such as estimating how much time a task will take, the first number that comes to mind can unduly influence your planning. What makes anchoring bias especially challenging is that it affects experts as well as novices. Financial analysts, real estate agents, and even experienced negotiators can fall prey to this bias, sometimes leading to suboptimal decisions. It's not that our brains are inherently flawed. Rather, anchoring is a byproduct of our need to simplify complex decision-making processes. By reducing the cognitive load required to make a decision, our minds use the most readily available information as a shortcut, even if that information isn't fully representative of the broader context. One way to see anchoring bias at work is in the way news headlines can shape our perceptions. When media outlets repeatedly highlight extreme or unusual events, those events become the anchors that shape our understanding of a topic, even if statistically they are rare. This can lead to skewed perceptions about risks and realities, influencing everything from public opinion to policy decisions. Another interesting aspect of anchoring bias is its persistence. Once an anchor is set, it can be very difficult to completely eliminate its influence. Even if we are aware of the bias, the initial piece of information continues to exert its pull. This is why being mindful of anchoring bias is important. Actively seeking out additional data points or deliberately considering multiple reference points before making a decision can help dilute the effect of the initial anchor. For example, when estimating a value or making a choice, you might ask yourself, what would be a reasonable range if I consider several sources of information rather than just the first figure I encountered? Understanding anchoring bias not only improves our personal decision-making, but also has broader implications for social and economic behavior. In marketing, for instance, companies often set high initial prices so that subsequent discounts feel more attractive. In negotiations, both buyers and sellers can benefit from recognizing how the opening offer might be shaping their expectations. By being aware of this tendency, you can take steps to counterbalance the influence of an initial anchor, leading to more balanced and informed decisions. Overall, anchoring bias is a reminder of how our cognitive shortcuts, while useful for managing everyday decisions, can sometimes lead us astray. By acknowledging that our first impressions or initial pieces of information can disproportionately affect our judgments, we empower ourselves to seek a more rounded and objective perspective. In doing so, we can make better decisions, whether it's negotiating a deal or planning our budgets, or simply forming our opinions about the world around us. Hindsight bias is a cognitive distortion in which we see past events as having been predictable after they have already occurred. Once we know an outcome, our memories and judgments are altered so that what once seemed uncertain now appears obvious, leading us to think, "I knew it all along." This phenomenon shapes our interpretation of events by retrospectively inflating our ability to foresee outcomes, even when, in reality, the events were far less predictable at the time. For example, consider a situation where a business venture fails. Before the outcome was known, there might have been many uncertainties and risks, but after the fact, people often insist that the signs were clear all along. They might point to minor details or warning signs and claim that these indicators made the failure inevitable. This process of reconstruction isn't necessarily a deliberate effort to assign blame. Instead, it is a natural cognitive process that helps us make sense of the past. By reshaping our memories to fit the outcome, we create a coherent narrative that minimizes ambiguity, even though this narrative might oversimplify the complexities involved. The roots of hindsight bias lie in our desire for cognitive consistency and predictability. Our brains are wired to seek patterns and make sense of events by linking cause and effect. Once an outcome is known, our mind retrofits the details to align with that outcome. This can lead us to underestimate the uncertainty that was present at the moment of decision-making. As a result, we may overestimate our ability to predict future events based on past outcomes, which can lead to overconfidence in our judgments and decision-making processes. Hindsight bias can also have significant social and interpersonal implications. In legal contexts, for instance, jurors may judge a defendant more harshly by believing that the negative outcome was foreseeable, even if the decision was made under considerable uncertainty. In the workplace, managers might criticize employees for not anticipating problems that, in hindsight, seem obvious, creating an environment where employees are unfairly held accountable for outcomes that were not clear-cut at the time. This bias not only distorts our perception of past events, but also influences how we assign blame and responsibility, often leading to unjust evaluations of performance and decision-making. Moreover, hindsight bias can affect our personal lives. After a breakup or a missed opportunity, you might find yourself reflecting on what should have been done differently. This reflective process, though seemingly helpful for learning from past mistakes, often leads to harsh self-criticism. When we convince ourselves that we could have foreseen the outcome, we ignore the complexity and uncertainty that we actually faced. Over time, this can erode self-confidence and create a persistent sense of regret, or if only thinking, even though the past cannot be changed. An important aspect of hindsight bias is that it operates subconsciously. We rarely notice that our memories are being reconstructed to make events seem more predictable. Because this bias is so ingrained, it can reinforce itself. Every time we look back at an event, we may unconsciously alter our recollection of our previous uncertainty. This makes it challenging to learn from our mistakes objectively, as we might end up overestimating our foresight and underestimating the true complexity of decision-making processes. Being aware of hindsight bias is the first step in mitigating its effects. One strategy to counter this bias is to document your thoughts and predictions at the time of making a decision. Keeping a record of your initial beliefs and the reasons behind your choices allows you to compare your original assessment with the outcome later on. This practice can help remind you that many events were far from inevitable, highlighting the genuine uncertainty you faced at the time. Another way to combat hindsight bias is to actively consider alternative outcomes and the factors that contributed to the final result. By asking yourself questions like, what were the possible outcomes? Or, which aspects of the situation were unpredictable? You can develop a more balanced understanding of the events, recognizing that outcomes are often the result of multiple factors. rather than the product of clear-cut predictions, helps you appreciate the inherent uncertainty in complex decisions. In summary, hindsight bias is a pervasive cognitive distortion that reshapes our understanding of past events by making them seem more predictable than they really were. It influences how we remember our decisions, assign blame, and evaluate our own foresight, often leading to overconfidence in our ability to predict future events and harsh judgments of past actions. By acknowledging the role of hindsight bias in our thought processes and adopting strategies like recording our initial thoughts and considering alternative outcomes, we can foster a more nuanced and accurate perspective on both our past decisions and future challenges. Negativity bias is a cognitive tendency where negative experiences and information grab our attention and stick in our memory far more than positive or neutral ones. This means that even if we encounter an equal number of positive and negative events, the negative ones tend to leave a much stronger impression. Our brains are naturally wired to focus on potential threats, a survival mechanism that helped our ancestors avoid danger in a hostile environment. When you think about it, if you were in a prehistoric setting, noticing a predator or a dangerous situation could literally mean the difference between life and death. That instinct to be hypervigilant about anything negative still influences us today, even though our modern world is generally much safer. Because of negativity bias, a single criticism at work can overshadow a host of compliments, or one bad review might ruin your overall perception of a product or service, even if most of the feedback is positive. This bias not only affects our personal moods and self-esteem, but also colors our interpretation of news and social interactions. For example, many of us find that when scrolling through our social media feeds, the negative headlines or comments catch our eye more readily than the positive ones, often leaving us feeling anxious or pessimistic about the world. In everyday decision-making, negativity bias plays a significant role. When faced with choices, we tend to give more weight to potential losses than to equivalent gains. Losing a modest amount of money feels more painful than the pleasure we derive from gaining the same amount, which can lead us to be overly cautious. This skewed perspective might make us reject opportunities that, on balance, could be beneficial because we focus too much on the possibility of failure or loss. The impact of negativity bias can be seen not only in personal judgments, but also in broader societal contexts. For instance, media outlets are well aware of this bias and often emphasize negative stories because they know such stories capture our attention. As a result, the news can paint a much bleaker picture of the world than what the overall trends might suggest. This constant exposure to negative news can reinforce our perception that things are worse than they really are, which in turn shapes our beliefs about the future and our overall outlook on life. Social relationships are also affected by negativity bias. In conversations, one harsh comment can linger and affect our impressions of a person far more than several positive comments would. This can lead to conflicts where minor disagreements escalate into larger issues because the negative aspects are remembered more vividly than the positive ones. Over time, this focus on the negative can erode trust and satisfaction in relationships, making it harder to see the full picture of someone's character. On a personal level, negativity bias can contribute to feelings of depression and anxiety. When our minds fixate on negative events, we may start to feel that our life is filled with failure or misfortune, even if that isn't the case. This distorted view not only affects how we feel in the moment, but also colors our expectations for the future. We might expect the worst to happen because our memory is filled with vivid recollections of past disappointments, which can create a self-fulfilling cycle of negative thinking. Interestingly, while negativity bias is hardwired into our brains, research has shown that we can work to counteract it. One effective way is by consciously taking time to recognize and savor positive experiences. For instance, after a good meal, a pleasant conversation, or a personal success, pausing to reflect on the details of the experience can help reinforce the positive memory. Over time, by deliberately focusing on what went well, you can begin to rebalance your attention away from the negative. Another strategy involves being mindful of how you process information. When you catch yourself dwelling on a negative event, it can be helpful to ask yourself whether you're giving it more weight than it deserves. Sometimes simply questioning the intensity of your reaction can provide a moment of perspective, allowing you to see that while the negative event is important, it may not be as defining or as likely to recur as your mind might suggest. Negativity bias also highlights the importance of perspective in shaping our emotional responses. By understanding that our brains are predisposed to overemphasize negative information, we can remind ourselves that this is a normal, even evolutionary response, rather than an absolute reflection of reality. This realization can empower you to seek a more balanced view, looking not only at the dangers and losses, but also at the positive aspects that are often overlooked. Ultimately, while negativity bias has helped humans survive in dangerous times, in our modern context, it can sometimes hold us back. It can skew our perception of our own lives and the world around us, leading to increased anxiety, a more pessimistic outlook, and even strained relationships. By becoming aware of this bias and actively working to counterbalance it through practices like mindfulness, gratitude, and reflective thinking, we can train our minds to give a fairer, more balanced consideration to both the good and the bad. This, in turn, can help improve our mood, boost our decision-making, and lead to a healthier, more optimistic perspective on life. The sunk cost fallacy is a cognitive bias where we continue investing time, money, or effort into a decision, project, or relationship simply because of the resources we have already committed, even when it would be more rational to cut our losses. In essence, rather than making decisions based solely on future benefits and costs, we let past investments dictate our actions. For example, imagine you've bought an expensive ticket to a concert, but on the day of the event, you're feeling sick. Even though staying home might be the better choice for your health, you might force yourself to go because you don't want the money you spent to go to waste. This bias often leads us to persist in projects that are clearly failing, or to continue relationships that no longer serve us, all because we can't let go of what we've already invested. The roots of this fallacy lie in our natural discomfort with waste. Human beings generally do not like to feel that resources have been squandered. This feeling can trigger regret and loss aversion, which makes us cling to our past decisions. Economically speaking, rational decision-making would dictate that only future costs and benefits matter. What has already been spent should be considered sunk and irrelevant to the decision at hand. However, our emotional attachment to these past investments clouds our judgment, making it difficult to abandon a course of action, even when the smart choice would be to walk away. One common scenario is in business. Companies sometimes continue to pour money into projects that aren't yielding returns simply because they've already spent so much on them. This escalation of commitment can lead to even greater losses, as decision-makers justify further investments by saying that the project can't be abandoned now without wasting everything. Similarly, in personal life, you might find yourself stuck in a long-term relationship or a career path that is no longer fulfilling because of the years or effort you've already put into it. The sunk cost fallacy can trap you in a cycle where you feel that quitting is a personal failure, even if staying is clearly detrimental in the long run. What makes the sunk cost fallacy particularly insidious is that it affects both our conscious decisions and our underlying emotional state. It's not just that we're making a poor economic decision, it's also that our self-esteem becomes tied to the idea of not wasting what we've already invested. This can lead to irrational persistence, where even when all evidence suggests that the best option is to change direction, our emotional investment prevents us from doing so. One way to counteract this bias is by consciously reframing your decision-making process. Instead of focusing on what you've already spent, try to think about the future and the potential benefits or losses moving forward. Ask yourself, if I were starting from scratch today, would I make the same decision? This can help you separate your past investments from your future choices. It might also be useful to set predetermined criteria for when to abandon a project or change a strategy. Criteria that are based on expected future outcomes rather than past costs. Another effective strategy is to regularly reflect on and review your decisions, both past and present, with a critical eye. By taking a step back and examining whether your choices are being driven by the fear of wasted resources rather than by a clear-eyed analysis of future benefits, you can begin to recognize patterns in your behavior that are influenced by the sunk cost fallacy. For instance, if you notice that you often continue to invest in failing projects, you can try to develop a habit of pausing and reassessing whether your continued investment is truly justified by the potential return or merely an emotional response to past losses. It's also helpful to talk through your decisions with someone who is not as emotionally involved. An outside perspective can provide valuable insights and help you see the situation more objectively. They might point out that the resources you've already spent cannot be recovered, and that holding on to them is preventing you from redirecting your efforts toward more promising opportunities. Understanding the sunk cost fallacy also has broader implications. In policymaking, for example, governments might continue funding outdated or ineffective programs simply because of the large investments already made, even when new evidence suggests that reallocating those funds would yield better results. On a personal level, recognizing this bias can help you make more rational decisions about where to invest your time, energy, and resources, leading to better outcomes in various aspects of your life. Ultimately, the key to overcoming the sunk cost fallacy is to acknowledge that past investments are, by definition, sunk. They cannot be recovered. Rather than letting them dictate your future actions, focus on the present situation and the potential benefits and costs that lie ahead. By doing so, you free yourself to make decisions that are aligned with your current goals and values, rather than being trapped by what you can't change. In summary, the sunk cost fallacy is a powerful example of how our emotional attachments to past investments can distort our decision-making, whether in business, personal relationships, or everyday choices. It can lead to continued investment in failing ventures. By recognizing this bias, refocusing on future outcomes, and seeking objective feedback, you can break free from the cycle of irrational persistence and make choices that truly benefit your long-term well-being. Groupthink is a phenomenon in which the desire for harmony and conformity within a group leads members to make faulty or irrational decisions. Instead of critically analyzing alternative ideas or raising concerns, group members tend to suppress dissenting opinions, avoid conflict, and ultimately converge on a decision that may not be the best available option. The term was first popularized by Irving Janis, who described groupthink as an environment in which the pressure to reach consensus overrides realistic appraisal of alternatives and critical thinking. At the heart of groupthink is a strong sense of cohesiveness that makes individuals reluctant to voice objections or challenge the prevailing opinions. This can occur in groups that are highly insulated from outside influences, where the leader's opinions are dominant, and where members share similar backgrounds or values. Under such conditions, even if a particular course of action has obvious flaws, the group may ignore warning signs simply because members are more focused on maintaining group unity than on evaluating potential risks. A classic example of groupthink is seen in historical events, such as the Bay of Pigs invasion or the Challenger space shuttle disaster, where decision-makers overlooked important information and alternative strategies because they were too committed to a consensus. One of the key symptoms of groupthink is the illusion of invulnerability. When group members are overly optimistic, they may underestimate risks and overestimate their ability to overcome challenges. This can lead to a false sense of security, where any dissenting opinion is seen as unnecessary or even disloyal. Related to this is collective rationalization. Members of the group tend to downplay or dismiss warnings and contradictory evidence by convincing themselves that any issues are not significant enough to derail the plan. In addition, an unquestioned belief in the inherent morality of the group can lead members to ignore ethical concerns. They may assume that their decisions are morally sound simply because they come from a unified group. Another element of groupthink is the tendency to stereotype outsiders or dissenters. People who are not part of the group or who challenge the group's decisions are often labeled as uninformed, biased, or even malicious, which further discourages open discussion. Within the group, there is also self-censorship, where individuals withhold their doubts and concerns to avoid disrupting the harmony. This creates an environment where the illusion of unanimity grows stronger. Members come to believe that everyone is in agreement, even when silent reservations exist. Some groups also engage in mind guarding, where certain members are unofficially tasked with shielding the group from contradictory information, further reinforcing the dominant viewpoint. The consequences of groupthink can be severe. Poor decisions made under its influence can lead to significant financial losses, failures in strategic planning, or even catastrophic outcomes in high-stakes situations like military operations or large-scale public policy decisions. groupthink can stifle innovation because it discourages creative thinking and the exploration of alternative solutions. When a group becomes so insular that it only hears its own ideas, it loses the benefits that come from diverse perspectives and critical feedback. To counteract groupthink, it is important to establish an environment where dissent is not only accepted, but encouraged. One effective strategy is to assign a devil's advocate in the group, someone whose role is to intentionally challenge ideas and bring up potential pitfalls. This can help ensure that the group thoroughly examines all options before reaching a decision. Another approach is to invite external experts or outside opinions to provide a fresh perspective on the issue at hand. Breaking the group into smaller, independent teams to discuss the problem can also be beneficial. When the teams reconvene, comparing different viewpoints can help prevent a single, dominant perspective from taking over. It is also essential to cultivate a culture where critical thinking is valued over the mere appearance of consensus. Leaders play a crucial role in this regard. They must be willing to entertain questions and not immediately dismiss opposing views. Encouraging open dialogue and creating structured decision-making processes that require the evaluation of all alternatives can help guard against the risks of groupthink. In practice, this might mean setting clear decision criteria, conducting regular reviews of decisions made, and being prepared to revise or reverse decisions if new information comes to light. In summary, groupthink represents a powerful and dangerous bias that can lead groups to make poor decisions by prioritizing conformity over critical evaluation. Recognizing its symptoms, such as the illusion of invulnerability, self-censorship, and the stereotyping of dissenters, is the first step toward mitigating its effects. By promoting an environment of open communication, encouraging diverse perspectives, and systematically evaluating alternatives, groups can work to overcome the pitfalls of groupthink and make decisions that are more thoughtful, creative, and ultimately effective. The Dunning-Kruger effect is a cognitive bias in which people with low ability or knowledge in a particular domain tend to overestimate their competence, while those with higher ability may underestimate their own skills. In simple terms, when someone doesn't know much about a subject, they often lack the awareness to accurately judge their own limitations, which leads them to be overly confident in their understanding. This phenomenon was first identified in a series of studies by social psychologists David Dunning and Justin Kruger in 1999. They found that individuals who performed poorly on tests of humor, grammar, and logic often rated their performance much higher than it actually was, simply because they didn't know what good performance looked like. At the heart of the Dunning-Kruger effect is a kind of metacognitive failure, a lack of insight into one's own skills. When you're not well informed or skilled, you can miss the critical feedback that would normally help you learn and improve. Imagine a beginner trying to play a musical instrument. Without a solid grasp of the basics, they might believe that every note they play sounds great because they aren't aware of the subtle differences that make a performance truly outstanding. Conversely, experts who have a deep understanding of the nuances involved may assume that tasks that are simple for them are equally simple for others. This can lead to a kind of underestimation of their own expertise because they have a more realistic view of how challenging the subject really is. One key aspect of the effect is that it creates a feedback loop. When someone overestimates their abilities, they are less likely to seek improvement or constructive criticism, reinforcing their misperception. They may even resist learning new information because they already believe they know enough. This stubborn confidence can be dangerous in many areas, from making decisions at work to engaging in public debates, because it can lead to poor outcomes based on flawed judgments. For example, consider a novice investor who is new to the stock market. Lacking the necessary expertise, they might confidently invest large sums in risky ventures because they overestimate their ability to predict market trends. Their misplaced confidence can lead to significant financial losses, and the very fact that they failed might not even prompt them to reassess their skills critically. On the other hand, a seasoned investor, aware of the complexities and uncertainties of the market, might be more cautious and even underestimate how good they are compared to others, always mindful of the potential risks and their own limitations. What makes the Dunning-Kruger effect particularly interesting is that it highlights the importance of metacognition, our ability to think about our own thinking. Good decision-making requires not just knowledge about a subject, but also an accurate self-assessment of what we know and what we don't. When that self-assessment is off, it can lead to overconfidence in low-ability individuals and undue self-doubt in high-ability individuals. This disparity can affect everything from everyday choices to high-stakes decisions in professional settings. The effect also plays a significant role in group dynamics and public discourse. In many debates or discussions, the loudest voices are not necessarily the most knowledgeable. Instead, they may be those who overestimate their competence and are less open to criticism. This can result in an environment where misinformation spreads, because those with the least understanding are the most assertive in their opinions. Meanwhile, experts may remain quiet, either because they doubt how well their insights will be received, or because they assume others already understand the complexities of the issue. Another interesting dimension is how the effect impacts learning and improvement. When people recognize the Dunning-Kruger effect, they can take steps to counteract it by actively seeking feedback, studying the subject more deeply, and comparing their own views with those of recognized experts. By doing so, they improve their metacognitive skills and become better at judging their own abilities accurately. Essentially, the first step toward overcoming overconfidence is realizing that what you think you know may only be a small fraction of what there is to learn. Ultimately, the Dunning-Kruger effect serves as a reminder of the limits of our self-awareness. It suggests that intellectual humility is crucial, not only acknowledging what you know, but also recognizing the vast areas where your knowledge might be lacking. This awareness can lead to better decision-making, more effective learning, and a healthier approach to self-improvement. Whether in personal growth, academic pursuits, or professional endeavors, understanding and addressing this bias can help ensure that confidence is based on competence rather than a false sense of security. In summary, the Dunning-Kruger effect illustrates how those with limited knowledge often overestimate their capabilities, while more skilled individuals might underestimate their expertise. This cognitive bias has significant implications for how we learn, interact in groups, and make decisions. By being aware of this tendency, we can take steps to ensure that our confidence is well-founded, seek out constructive feedback, and strive for a more accurate understanding of our own strengths and limitations. Ultimately, embracing a mindset of continual learning and intellectual humility can help counteract the pitfalls of the Dunning-Kruger effect and lead to more informed, balanced decision-making. The self-serving bias is a cognitive tendency where individuals explain their successes as a result of their own abilities, effort, or personal traits, while attributing failures to external factors such as luck, unfavorable circumstances, or the actions of others. In essence, when things go well, people give themselves the credit, but when they don't, the blame is shifted away from themselves. This bias serves to protect one's self-esteem and maintain a positive self-image, acting as an emotional buffer against the pain of failure. At its core, the self-serving bias helps people feel better about themselves. For example, if a student receives a high grade on an exam, they might attribute it to their intelligence or hard work. In contrast, if they perform poorly, they may blame the exam's difficulty, poor teaching, or even bad luck, rather than accepting that their preparation was inadequate. This way of thinking reinforces a positive view of oneself, even if it sometimes means distorting the actual reasons behind outcomes. In everyday life, this bias is evident in many contexts. Consider a workplace scenario. An employee might take full credit for a project's success, citing their expertise and leadership, while any setbacks or failures are blamed on external obstacles or unsupportive colleagues. This can lead to overconfidence and a lack of accountability, as individuals become less inclined to learn from their mistakes if they consistently see failures as beyond their control. Over time, such a pattern may result in a skewed self-perception, where achievements are inflated and errors are minimized. The self-serving bias also influences interpersonal relationships and group dynamics. In a team setting, members might insist that their contributions were the primary reason for a successful outcome, while dismissing the roles others played. This can create tension and conflict within groups, as it undermines the collaborative spirit by encouraging a focus on individual accolades rather than collective effort. Similarly, in social interactions, people may overemphasize their positive qualities when comparing themselves to others, sometimes leading to arrogance or a lack of empathy. Research has shown that the self-serving bias is not uniform across all situations or cultures. In individualistic societies, where personal achievement is highly valued, the bias tends to be more pronounced. In more collectivist cultures, people are often encouraged to see success as a group effort, and may exhibit a more balanced view of personal and collective contributions. Moreover, a person's self-esteem can influence how this bias manifests. Individuals with high self-esteem are more likely to attribute successes internally, while those with low self-esteem might sometimes reverse the bias, attributing success to external factors and blaming themselves for failures. This cognitive bias, while protective, can have some downsides. When overused, it may prevent individuals from accurately assessing their own performance and learning from their mistakes. If someone consistently credits themselves for every success, they might ignore valuable feedback that could help them improve. Similarly, if failures are always seen as external and unchangeable, there is little incentive to develop new skills or strategies to overcome challenges. In decision-making processes, this bias can contribute to persistent errors because it limits self-reflection and constructive criticism, leading to a cycle where overconfidence hinders growth. The self-serving bias is not just a quirk of individual psychology. It can also have broader societal impacts. In fields such as business or politics, leaders influenced by this bias may make overly risky decisions or fail to adapt to new information, believing that their past achievements guarantee future success. When groups or organizations collectively exhibit this bias, it can lead to systemic issues where failures are repeatedly ignored and innovative solutions are overlooked in favor of maintaining a flawed status quo. One of the ways to counteract the self-serving bias is to consciously seek out and welcome external feedback. By asking for honest critiques from colleagues, mentors, or friends, individuals can gain a more balanced view of their performance. Reflecting on both successes and failures in a deliberate and objective manner can help mitigate the tendency to oversimplify outcomes as entirely due to personal factors or entirely due to external ones. Additionally, cultivating a mindset of intellectual humility, recognizing that there is always room for improvement, can lead to more effective learning and growth. Ultimately, while the self-serving bias can be a useful psychological tool for maintaining self-esteem in the face of adversity, it also carries the risk of distorting reality. When we overcredit our own abilities and underplay our shortcomings, we miss opportunities for learning and improvement. Acknowledging this bias can encourage us to adopt a more balanced perspective, where successes are celebrated, but failures are also seen as chances to grow. This balanced approach not only benefits individual development, but also fosters healthier and more constructive relationships, both in personal interactions and in broader group settings. Fundamental attribution error is a pervasive cognitive bias where we tend to overemphasize the role of personal traits and internal factors when explaining someone else's behavior, while underestimating the impact of external, situational influences. In other words, when we see someone acting in a particular way, our immediate reaction is often to assume that their behavior reflects their character, rather than considering the context that might have shaped their actions. Imagine you're driving on a busy road and another driver cuts you off. Your instinctive reaction might be to label that person as rude, careless, or even aggressive. You quickly form an impression that their behavior is due to a negative personality trait. Yet, there could be several situational factors at play. Perhaps they were responding to an emergency, under severe stress, or simply made an honest mistake because of distractions. Despite these possibilities, our brains default to attributing their behavior to who they are as a person. This tendency not only colors our judgments about others, but can also influence how we interpret our own actions when things don't go as planned. At its core, fundamental attribution error is about how we process information. When we evaluate someone else's behavior, our focus narrows in on what is immediately visible, the actions themselves, rather than the broader context. This bias is partly due to the fact that internal dispositions, like personality traits, are seen as more stable and consistent over time than situational factors, which can change from moment to moment. Our cognitive processes, therefore, lean towards a simpler explanation. It's easier to conclude that someone acted a certain way because they were inherently that kind of person, rather than trying to piece together all the environmental influences that might have contributed. This bias has significant implications in everyday life. For example, in the workplace, If a colleague misses a deadline, you might quickly think they're lazy or unorganized, ignoring external pressures such as unrealistic timelines or unexpected challenges. In relationships, this can lead to misunderstandings. You might assume a friend's curt reply is due to their irritable nature, rather than considering they might be having a bad day. Even in media consumption, we are prone to attribute the actions of public figures to their personal failings, without fully considering the complex interplay of political, social, and economic factors. Interestingly, while fundamental attribution error is a common error in our thinking about others, we tend to behave differently when evaluating our own actions. When we fail at something, we are more likely to attribute our shortcomings to external circumstances, such as bad luck or an unfair situation, rather than acknowledging our own limitations. This difference helps maintain our self-esteem, but can also lead to a lack of accountability or self-improvement, because we may overlook the areas where we need to grow. Researchers have long studied this bias, noting that it occurs in various cultural contexts, although the extent and manifestation can vary. Some cultures emphasize situational factors more, which might reduce the bias, while others that value individualism may see it more strongly. The tendency to make such internal attributions can sometimes lead to unfair or overly harsh judgments about others, reinforcing stereotypes and even contributing to social conflicts. To mitigate the effects of fundamental attribution error, one useful strategy is to deliberately consider situational factors when evaluating behavior. Ask yourself, what external pressures or circumstances might have influenced this person's actions? Or, could there be something in the environment that made this behavior more likely? Taking a moment to step back and reflect on the broader context can lead to more balanced and empathetic judgments. Another approach is to seek out more complete information before forming a final opinion. Instead of jumping to conclusions based on a single incident, try to gather additional data or observe the situation over time. This can help in distinguishing between a one-off behavior and a consistent pattern that might truly reflect a person's disposition. In summary, fundamental attribution error reminds us that our first impressions are often overly simplistic. We have a natural inclination to explain behavior by attributing it to personality rather than considering situational influences. While this cognitive shortcut can be efficient, it also risks misjudging others and fostering negative stereotypes. By cultivating a habit of questioning our initial assumptions and taking the time to understand the context, we can make fairer, more informed evaluations of the people around us. This shift in perspective not only improves interpersonal relationships, but also encourages a more nuanced and compassionate view of human behavior. Mind reading is a cognitive distortion in which we assume we know what others are thinking or feeling without any solid evidence. This mental shortcut may seem useful at first, for instance, noticing someone's brief frown and immediately assuming they are upset with you, but it often leads to inaccurate interpretations of social interactions and fuels unnecessary anxiety. When you engage in mind reading, your mind fills in the gaps with your own assumptions, which are usually colored by your past experiences and insecurities, rather than by the facts of the situation. This distorted way of thinking can cause you to misinterpret neutral or even positive signals as negative, leading to strained relationships and heightened social anxiety. Imagine walking into a meeting and noticing a colleague's silence. Instead of considering that they might simply be deep in thought or preoccupied, you might quickly conclude that they are judging you harshly. This assumption may trigger feelings of self-doubt or even cause you to withdraw from the conversation. Similarly, if a friend doesn't immediately respond to a message, you might jump to the conclusion that they are upset with you or that you've done something wrong. These assumptions, made without verifying the reality of the situation, can spiral into a self-fulfilling prophecy where your behavior, such as withdrawing or acting defensively, actually brings about the very response you feared. The danger of mind reading lies in its capacity to distort reality. Rather than gathering information or asking clarifying questions, you rely on your interpretation of body language, tone, or even your own emotional state to read another person's mind. This often results in an overemphasis on potential rejection or disapproval, even when there is little or no evidence to support such conclusions. Over time, this can create an internal narrative where you constantly feel misunderstood or undervalued, reinforcing low self-esteem and increasing feelings of isolation. What exacerbates the problem is that mind reading is usually a subconscious process. You might not even be aware that you are engaging in this distortion because it happens automatically. Your brain takes the shortcut as a way to quickly make sense of social interactions. Unfortunately, these quick assumptions can lead you to misjudge situations and people. For example, you might assume that someone's offhand remark is a personal attack, even though they may have been making a general observation or simply distracted. This not only affects your mood, but can also impact your behavior. You might become defensive, avoidant, or even confrontational, which in turn can lead to conflicts that might never have occurred if you had taken the time to seek clarification. The consequences of mind reading extend beyond individual interactions. In professional settings, for instance, if you assume that a colleague or supervisor is critical of your work based solely on minor cues, you might avoid taking risks or sharing innovative ideas, thereby stifling your own growth and productivity. Over time, this habitual distortion can also lead to persistent anxiety and depression as the negative assumptions accumulate and reinforce a biased view of yourself and others. To overcome mind reading, the first step is to become aware of when you are engaging in it. Recognize that your assumptions about others' thoughts are not facts. Instead of automatically jumping to conclusions, pause and ask yourself what concrete evidence you have for your belief. Consider alternative explanations. For instance, if a friend seems quiet, maybe they are simply tired or preoccupied, rather than upset with you. Another effective strategy is to verify your assumptions through direct communication. Instead of assuming what someone might be thinking, try asking them about their feelings or thoughts in a respectful and non-confrontational way. This not only helps clear up misunderstandings, but also encourages more open and honest interactions. By replacing your assumptions with actual dialogue, you give yourself a more accurate picture of the situation. Mind reading is also closely tied to our self-esteem. When we assume that others are thinking negatively about us, it reinforces feelings of inadequacy and can create a cycle of negative self-judgment. Learning to challenge these automatic thoughts by reminding yourself that you don't have all the information can help break this cycle. practicing mindfulness and cognitive restructuring techniques, where you critically evaluate your thoughts and consider whether they are truly supported by evidence, can gradually weaken the habit of mind reading. In summary, mind reading is a common cognitive distortion that leads us to assume we know what others are thinking, often with a negative bias that can harm our relationships and emotional well-being. By becoming aware of this habit, questioning your assumptions, and seeking direct clarification, you can begin to break free from its grip. Over time, these changes can foster more accurate perceptions of social interactions, reduce anxiety, and contribute to healthier, more effective communication with others. Recognizing that your interpretations are only one possibility among many is key to developing a more balanced and compassionate view of both yourself and those around you. Fortune-telling is a cognitive distortion in which you predict negative outcomes without any solid evidence that those outcomes will actually occur, and then you behave as if those predicted outcomes are inevitable. This mental habit involves assuming that things will turn out badly, even when the evidence is inconclusive or there is reason to be hopeful. When you engage in fortune-telling, you might convince yourself that you'll fail an exam, lose a job, or experience a relationship breakdown long before any such outcome has actually happened. This pattern of thinking often leads to heightened anxiety and can make you feel trapped in a cycle of pessimism and defeat, where your own expectations become a self-fulfilling prophecy. Imagine, for example, that you have an important presentation coming up. Instead of preparing with a balanced view of the situation, you might start telling yourself that you're definitely going to stumble over your words, that the audience will laugh at you, and that your career is over if the presentation doesn't go perfectly. These negative predictions aren't based on evidence from previous experiences or on realistic assessments of the situation. They're simply assumptions you've made in order to brace yourself against a feared outcome. As a result, you might experience overwhelming stress and self-doubt, which ironically can undermine your actual performance, thereby reinforcing your negative prediction. This distortion is particularly insidious because it shifts your focus away from the present moment. Instead of engaging fully with the task at hand, or even considering a range of possible outcomes, you become consumed by an imagined future that is overwhelmingly negative. The brain, conditioned by past experiences of hardship or failure, tends to latch on to these negative predictions as a way of preparing for danger. However, in many cases, this preparation is counterproductive. Rather than motivating you to do better, the constant anticipation of failure can sap your energy and enthusiasm, making it more difficult to succeed. Fortune-telling often goes hand in hand with other cognitive distortions such as catastrophizing and mind reading. While catastrophizing involves blowing a situation out of proportion and imagining the worst-case scenario, fortune-telling is about predicting that the worst will come to pass. Similarly, while mind reading involves assuming you know what others are thinking, fortune-telling projects your own negative expectations into the future without checking the facts. These interconnected distortions can create a web of self-defeating thoughts where every decision and every interaction is colored by an expectation of disaster. The impact of fortune-telling is not limited to individual anxiety. It can have broader effects on your behavior and decision-making. When you constantly predict negative outcomes, you may avoid taking risks or seizing opportunities. For example, you might decline a job offer or avoid asking for a promotion because you're convinced that something will go wrong, even if the evidence points to a positive opportunity. This avoidance reinforces the belief that you are incapable of achieving success, trapping you in a cycle of low self-esteem and missed chances for growth. Breaking free from fortune-telling requires a shift in perspective, one that is often supported by techniques from cognitive behavioral therapy, CBT. One useful strategy is to challenge your negative predictions by asking yourself what evidence you have that supports or contradicts your fears. Instead of simply assuming that failure is inevitable, you can list past experiences where things went well or where challenges were overcome. This evidence-based approach helps you see that while negative outcomes are possible, they are not a foregone conclusion. Another helpful approach is to consider alternative outcomes. Rather than fixating on the worst-case scenario, think about the full range of possible results, including the best case and most likely scenarios. By broadening your perspective, you can reduce the grip of a single negative prediction on your mood and behavior. Additionally, engaging in mindfulness practices can help you stay present in the moment, preventing your mind from wandering into a future filled with imagined disasters. Mindfulness encourages you to focus on what is happening right now, rather than getting caught up in what-if scenarios that may never materialize. It can also be beneficial to discuss your fears with trusted friends or colleagues who can provide a more objective viewpoint. Often, when you voice your concerns, you'll discover that others have similar worries, or that your predicted outcome is far less likely than you assumed. These conversations can help to temper your expectations and foster a more balanced view of future events. Ultimately, the key to overcoming the fortune-telling distortion is to recognize that while it may feel like your mind is protecting you by anticipating trouble, it is actually limiting your potential by locking you into a cycle of negativity. By questioning your predictions, considering alternative possibilities, and focusing on the present moment, you can gradually retrain your mind to adopt a more realistic and hopeful perspective. Recognizing that the future is uncertain and that it can be shaped by positive actions in the present can lead to more confident decision-making and a healthier, more optimistic outlook on life. Magnification and minimization are two sides of the same cognitive distortion that alter the way we perceive events and our own experiences. In essence, these distortions skew our reality by either blowing negative details way out of proportion, magnification, or downplaying positive aspects and strengths, minimization. When you magnify, a minor setback can feel like a catastrophic failure. For example, if you make a small mistake at work, you might convince yourself that this one error means you're entirely incompetent, even though it's just a tiny blemish on an otherwise solid record. This tendency can lead to excessive anxiety, a fear of failure, and an overwhelming sense of inadequacy. On the other hand, minimization occurs when you downplay your achievements or positive qualities. After accomplishing something noteworthy, you might tell yourself it was merely luck, ignoring your hard work and talent. This prevents you from truly recognizing your abilities and can keep your self-esteem unnaturally low. These distortions are like looking through a pair of faulty binoculars. One end exaggerates the negative, making it seem enormous, while the other end shrinks the positive to an almost negligible size. In everyday life, such patterns can create a vicious cycle where every minor error is magnified into proof of personal failure, and every small success is minimized into insignificance. This skewed perspective often leads to a self-fulfilling prophecy. When you believe you're incapable, you might avoid challenges, which only reinforces your negative self-image over time. Magnification can cause you to focus disproportionately on problems. If a single piece of feedback is slightly critical, you might disregard all the positive comments and fixate on that one critique. This distorted thinking not only increases stress and self-doubt, but can also paralyze decision-making and lead to procrastination. When you view challenges as insurmountable because you've blown them out of proportion, you're more likely to avoid taking action, which can further stymie progress in your personal or professional life. Conversely, minimization tends to rob you of the satisfaction and motivation that comes from acknowledging your achievements. By dismissing or undervaluing positive events, like telling yourself that a compliment or a small success was just a fluke, you miss opportunities to build self-confidence. Over time, this persistent pattern can contribute to feelings of worthlessness and low self-esteem, as your internal narrative remains unbalanced by the dismissal of your strengths. The interplay of magnification and minimization is particularly evident in conditions like anxiety and depression. An anxious individual might magnify the potential for danger in everyday situations, leading to constant worry and hypervigilance, while simultaneously minimizing their ability to cope with stress. A depressed person might similarly minimize any positive feedback or accomplishments, reinforcing a narrative of failure and hopelessness. In both cases, the cognitive distortions create a feedback loop that not only distorts perception, but also reinforces negative emotions and behaviors, making it difficult to break free from a cycle of self-criticism and fear. Fortunately, there are several strategies to counter these distortions. The first step is awareness. Recognize when you are exaggerating the negatives or downplaying the positives. Ask yourself, am I really seeing the situation as it is, or am I letting my emotions distort the facts? It can be very helpful to write down the situation and list the pros and cons objectively. For instance, if you made a mistake at work, write down the error and then list other instances where you succeeded or received positive feedback. This can help you balance your perspective and see that one mistake does not define your entire performance. Another effective method is cognitive restructuring, where you actively challenge your automatic thoughts. When you catch yourself magnifying a negative event, consider alternative explanations. Ask, what evidence do I have that this mistake is catastrophic? Or, how have I overcome similar challenges in the past? Similarly, when minimizing your successes, remind yourself of the effort and skill you invested to achieve them. Reflect on specific examples that highlight your competence and resilience. Mindfulness is also a valuable tool. By staying present and observing your thoughts without judgment, you can create a space where you recognize these distortions as just thoughts, not absolute truths. Techniques such as deep breathing, meditation, or simply taking a moment to pause and reflect can interrupt the automatic cycle of distorted thinking. Talking through your thoughts with a trusted friend, mentor, or therapist can provide additional perspective. An external viewpoint can help you see the situation more clearly. often revealing that what you magnified was a minor flaw and what you minimized was actually a significant achievement. This social feedback can be crucial in breaking the habitual patterns of distorted thinking. Ultimately, overcoming magnification and minimization involves developing a more balanced and nuanced view of yourself and your experiences. Recognize that life rarely falls into extremes. Instead, it's full of shades of gray. By challenging your initial reactions and learning to appreciate both the good and the bad in a situation, you can cultivate a healthier, more realistic mindset. This shift not only reduces anxiety and depression, but also empowers you to approach challenges with greater resilience and confidence. In summary, magnification and minimization are cognitive distortions that distort reality by exaggerating negatives and downplaying positives. They can lead to excessive worry, self-doubt, and a skewed self-image. By becoming aware of these patterns, challenging them through techniques like cognitive restructuring and mindfulness, and seeking balanced perspectives, you can gradually reframe your thoughts. This process is essential for improving mental well-being, enhancing decision-making, and building a more confident and resilient approach to life. Blame is a cognitive distortion in which a person consistently attributes fault or responsibility for negative outcomes entirely to external factors or other people, often ignoring the complex interplay of circumstances that led to an event. When we use blame as a way of thinking, we tend to oversimplify situations by saying things like, "It's all their fault," or "They made me do it," instead of acknowledging that multiple factors, including our own actions, might have contributed to what happened. This can be seen both in interpersonal conflicts and in our internal dialogue. For example, if a project at work doesn't meet expectations, rather than reflecting on aspects within our control, we might immediately think that a colleague's incompetence or an unfair work environment is solely to blame, even if the situation was more nuanced. Blame often serves as a defense mechanism. By placing the fault squarely on others, we can protect our self-esteem and avoid confronting our own mistakes or shortcomings. However, while this may provide short-term relief, it undermines personal growth and healthy communication in the long run. When we blame others without considering our own role, we close ourselves off to constructive feedback and miss opportunities for learning. Over time, an excessive reliance on blame can lead to a vicious cycle. Conflicts intensify, trust erodes, and our relationships become strained because each party is stuck in a mindset that prevents genuine understanding and collaboration. Another important aspect of blame as a cognitive distortion is that it tends to be rigid and unyielding. We may form a fixed belief that a particular person or situation is entirely at fault, even when new evidence suggests otherwise. This black and white thinking not only creates interpersonal tension, but also distorts our overall view of reality. It prevents us from seeing that, in many cases, both internal factors, like our own choices or behaviors, and external circumstances contribute to outcomes. By refusing to accept this complexity, we can become defensive and resistant to change, often interpreting any criticism, even when constructive, as an attack on our character. Blame also influences our emotional state in powerful ways. When we habitually blame others, we might feel anger, resentment, and frustration, emotions that can be all-consuming if left unchecked. These feelings, in turn, reinforce our tendency to blame, creating a feedback loop that can exacerbate stress and lead to further conflicts. Moreover, blame can interfere with problem solving. Instead of focusing on what can be learned from a mistake or how a situation might be improved, our energy is diverted into harboring negative feelings toward others. This not only impacts our mood, but can also hinder our ability to effectively address issues when they arise. To break free from the distortion of blame, it's crucial to cultivate awareness of our thought patterns. One effective strategy is to pause when you feel the impulse to assign blame and ask yourself, what evidence do I have that this one factor is solely responsible for the outcome? By examining the situation more objectively, you may find that there are multiple contributing factors, including your own actions. This self-reflection can open the door to a more balanced perspective. For instance, if a meeting didn't go as planned, instead of immediately blaming a colleague, consider how the lack of clear communication or your own unpreparedness might have played a role. Another helpful approach is to practice taking personal responsibility. Accepting that you too have a part in many outcomes can be liberating. It shifts the focus from feeling victimized by external circumstances to recognizing that you have the power to learn and grow from each experience. This doesn't mean taking all the blame for everything. It means developing a realistic understanding that outcomes are rarely the result of a single cause. Over time, this balanced approach can reduce feelings of anger and resentment and foster healthier relationships based on mutual understanding and shared accountability. Effective communication is also key to overcoming the blame distortion. When conflicts arise, rather than immediately pointing fingers, try engaging in open dialogue with the other person. Ask clarifying questions and listen to their perspective. By discussing the situation openly, you can uncover the multiple factors at play and work together to find solutions. This collaborative approach not only prevents misunderstandings, but also builds trust and empathy as each person feels heard and validated. Mindfulness techniques can support these efforts by helping you stay present and observe your thoughts without judgment. When you notice yourself slipping into blame, take a few deep breaths and acknowledge the thought as just one possibility, not an absolute truth. Over time, mindfulness can help you develop a habit of questioning automatic judgments and reduce the emotional intensity of your reactions. In addition to these strategies, cognitive restructuring techniques are very useful. This involves identifying the thought, "they are completely to blame," and then challenging it with evidence. Ask yourself, what would I say if I were advising a friend in a similar situation? Or, what other factors could have contributed to this outcome? By replacing blame with a more nuanced and balanced view, you empower yourself to move forward constructively. Over time, you may find that you are less prone to the rigid, all-or-nothing thinking that fuels blame, and more capable of recognizing the complexity of interpersonal dynamics. The control fallacy is a cognitive distortion where we misjudge how much influence we really have over events, often leading us to swing between two extremes. On one hand, you might feel overly responsible for outcomes, even those clearly outside your control, believing that if something goes wrong, it's entirely your fault. On the other hand, you may feel completely powerless, thinking that nothing you do matters because every outcome is dictated by external forces. Both extremes distort reality and can cause significant emotional distress. Imagine you're at work and a project fails. If you're caught in the internal control fallacy, you might convince yourself that you are solely to blame. You might think, if only I had done things differently, everything would have turned out fine. In this mindset, you overestimate your power to affect the outcome, even when many factors, like decisions made by others, market conditions, or unforeseen complications, played a part. This over-responsibility can lead to excessive guilt, anxiety, and a persistent fear of making mistakes, making it hard for you to move forward or even try new things. Conversely, if you lean toward the external control fallacy, you might feel utterly helpless. In this case, you might believe that no matter what effort you put in, the outcome is completely out of your hands. For instance, after a setback, instead of analyzing what you could have done differently, you might think, "Nothing I do will change the situation. It's all out of my control." This belief can sap your motivation and lead to passivity or even depression as you feel victimized by circumstances beyond your influence. Both forms of the control fallacy prevent you from engaging with reality in a balanced way. In many situations, there is a middle ground where you can control some aspects of the outcome, while other factors remain unpredictable. Recognizing this balance is key. Realistically, you might control your work ethic, the quality of your communication, and your own responses, but you can't control how others react or how external events unfold. When you acknowledge that some factors are within your influence and others are not, you free yourself from the burden of unwarranted guilt or the paralysis of helplessness. This cognitive distortion also impacts your relationships. If you always assume you're responsible for others' feelings, you may end up taking on more than you can handle, leading to burnout and resentment. On the flip side, if you believe you have no control at all, you might not even try to communicate or resolve conflicts, leaving misunderstandings to fester. Both extremes hinder effective problem-solving and can create a cycle of conflict or withdrawal that damages your personal and professional interactions. Another consequence of the control fallacy is its effect on your decision-making. When you overestimate your control, you might take on too many responsibilities or risk too much, believing you can manage everything perfectly. This can result in stress and overcommitment. Conversely, if you feel completely powerless, you might avoid taking action altogether, even when there are opportunities to improve your situation. In both cases, the distortion leads to decisions that are based on inaccurate perceptions of your ability to influence outcomes. To overcome the control fallacy, the first step is to cultivate self-awareness. Start by observing your thoughts when you encounter a challenging situation. Ask yourself whether you are assuming total responsibility for what's happened, or if you're dismissing any role you might have in influencing the outcome. Challenge these thoughts by looking for concrete evidence. For example, reflect on past experiences where you successfully influenced a situation, even if partially. Acknowledging these successes can help balance the belief that everything is either entirely in your control or completely out of it. Another helpful strategy is to break down situations into components you can control versus those you cannot. List out the factors involved and identify which aspects are within your power to change. This method not only clarifies the realistic boundaries of your influence, but also reduces anxiety by shifting focus to actionable steps rather than overwhelming generalizations. Communication plays a crucial role as well. Discussing your feelings with trusted friends, colleagues, or a therapist can provide an external perspective. They may point out aspects of a situation that you've either overestimated or underestimated. Such feedback is invaluable in recalibrating your understanding of control in different circumstances. Mindfulness is another powerful tool to address this distortion. Mindfulness practices encourage you to stay in the present moment and observe your thoughts without judgment. When you notice yourself thinking in extremes, either blaming yourself entirely or feeling completely helpless, mindfulness can help you pause, reflect, and regain a balanced perspective. Techniques like deep breathing or meditation can ground you, making it easier to let go of unhelpful thought patterns. Finally, cognitive restructuring techniques from cognitive behavioral therapy, CBT, can be particularly effective. These techniques involve actively questioning your assumptions about control. For instance, if you think, "It's all my fault," ask yourself, "What evidence do I have that supports this belief? What factors were beyond my control?" By challenging and reframing these thoughts, you can begin to see situations in a more realistic light, where you recognize both your own agency and the influence of external factors. The fallacy of fairness is a cognitive distortion in which you assume that life should operate according to a strict, equal set of rules. And when reality doesn't match those expectations, you feel deep frustration, resentment, or even anger. In other words, you hold the belief that if you work hard and play by the rules, you should always receive fair treatment or outcomes, and when you don't, it's perceived as a profound injustice. This belief often oversimplifies complex situations by ignoring the multitude of factors that influence outcomes, such as luck, circumstance, and the actions of others. Imagine working diligently on a project and expecting a promotion because you believe fairness dictates that hard work must be rewarded. When the promotion goes to someone else, you might immediately conclude that the decision was unfair, rather than considering that the decision might have been influenced by factors beyond your control, like company strategy, differing skill sets, or even subjective opinions of decision makers. This oversimplification can lead you to dwell on the injustice rather than using the experience as a learning opportunity. The fallacy of fairness can also work in the opposite direction. You might hold yourself to an impossible standard, thinking that you deserve only perfect results. So when you make a mistake, even a minor one, you might feel devastated and convinced that you've been treated unfairly by life. This self-imposed pressure can contribute to feelings of inadequacy and low self-esteem, creating a vicious cycle where the idea of fairness becomes a yardstick for your self-worth. What makes this distortion so powerful is that it taps into our deep-seated need for predictability and control. We naturally want to believe that the world is just, and that our actions have predictable outcomes. When things deviate from that expectation, the sense of injustice isn't just disappointing, it can be emotionally overwhelming. Over time, this persistent focus on fairness can lead to chronic bitterness and an inability to adapt when life doesn't go as planned. To break free from the fallacy of fairness, the first step is to recognize that life is inherently complex and that outcomes are rarely dictated by fairness alone. Start by challenging your assumption. Ask yourself whether you have considered all the factors that could have contributed to the outcome, both within your control and beyond it. For instance, reflect on times when you experienced setbacks despite your best efforts. and consider whether those outcomes were truly unfair or simply a result of circumstances that no one can control. Cognitive restructuring techniques can be very helpful here. Try to reframe the situation by focusing on what you can learn from it, rather than on the perceived injustice. Instead of thinking, "It's not fair that I didn't get the promotion," you might reframe it as, "I put in a lot of effort, and while I wasn't promoted this time, there are other opportunities to grow and prove my abilities." This shift in perspective can reduce the emotional sting of unfairness and empower you to take constructive action. Mindfulness practices also play a crucial role. By staying present and observing your thoughts without judgment, you can create the mental space needed to question your automatic reactions. When you catch yourself ruminating over an unfair situation, take a moment to breathe deeply and remind yourself that while life doesn't always follow a fair script, you still have the power to influence your own path and responses. It's equally important to develop realistic expectations. Understand that fairness is often a subjective concept, and that outcomes depend on a mix of personal effort, timing, external circumstances, and sometimes chance. By accepting that not every situation will be perfectly just, you allow yourself the flexibility to adapt and move forward, rather than getting stuck in a cycle of resentment. In relationships, clinging to the fallacy of fairness can lead to conflicts and miscommunication. When you insist that others must treat you as you believe they should, you may overlook the complexities of their perspectives and intentions. Instead of assuming that any deviation from your ideal of fairness is a personal slight, try engaging in open communication to understand the broader context. This can help build empathy and reduce unnecessary conflict. Ultimately, overcoming the fallacy of fairness involves shifting your focus from what you perceive as an injustice to what you can control: your own actions, responses, and growth. Recognize that life is full of gray areas where outcomes are influenced by a variety of factors, many of which are not under your control. By embracing this complexity and adjusting your expectations, you can lessen the negative emotional impact of perceived unfairness and foster a more balanced, resilient outlook. Comparative thinking is a cognitive process in which you constantly evaluate yourself in relation to others, often leading to an unbalanced view of your own abilities, achievements, or worth. In everyday life, this can manifest as frequently comparing your successes, appearance, career progress, or even your relationships with those of your peers. While some comparison can be useful for setting benchmarks or motivating improvement, when it becomes a habitual, automatic process, it can turn into a cognitive distortion that distorts reality. At its core, comparative thinking often involves two types of social comparisons: upward and downward. Upward comparisons occur when you compare yourself to people who seem to be doing better than you in some aspect of life. For example, seeing a colleague receive a promotion might lead you to think, "I'm not good enough," even if your achievements are strong on their own. This type of comparison can foster feelings of inadequacy, envy, or even depression because you focus solely on what you lack rather than on your own unique strengths. Downward comparisons, on the other hand, involve comparing yourself to others who seem to be worse off. While these comparisons might temporarily boost your self-esteem by highlighting your relative advantages, they can also lead to complacency. Instead of motivating you to improve, you might settle for less, because you feel you're already doing better than those you compare yourself to. Over time, both upward and downward, comparisons can reinforce a distorted self-image. You may ignore your progress or downplay your successes while overemphasizing your shortcomings. This unbalanced perspective can leave you feeling chronically unsatisfied or overly self-critical. Moreover, comparative thinking often ignores the complexity of individual circumstances. Everyone's journey is influenced by a myriad of factors: personal experiences, opportunities, challenges, and even luck that aren't easily comparable. When you judge yourself solely on how you stack up against others, you may overlook your unique context and the personal growth you've achieved over time. This can lead to unrealistic standards and the belief that you should be better by someone else's measure, which is both unfair and unhelpful. The negative impact of comparative thinking extends into many areas of life. In the workplace, constant comparisons can generate unhealthy competition, stress, and burnout, as you may focus on perceived inadequacies rather than on developing your own skills. In relationships, comparing yourself or your partner to others can create feelings of jealousy, dissatisfaction, or a sense that you are not enough. In terms of mental health, these persistent comparisons can contribute to anxiety and depression by creating a continual sense of failure or inadequacy. To counteract the pitfalls of comparative thinking, several strategies can be effective. First, it's important to cultivate self-awareness by monitoring your thoughts when you start comparing yourself to others. Ask yourself, what am I really comparing? Are the conditions and circumstances truly similar? Sometimes simply acknowledging that your comparisons are based on incomplete or biased information can help lessen their impact. Another helpful technique is to shift your focus inward. Instead of measuring your worth against external standards, concentrate on your own progress and personal goals. Keep a journal to record your achievements, however small, and reflect on how far you've come. Practicing gratitude can also help you appreciate your unique strengths and accomplishments, reducing the tendency to dwell on what others have. Mindfulness is a powerful tool in this process. By staying present and fully engaged in your own experience, you can reduce the time spent fixating on how you compare to others. Mindfulness practices, like deep breathing, meditation, or even short pauses during the day, help create mental space where you can observe your thoughts without judgment and gently redirect them towards a more balanced view. Finally, consider reframing your perspective. Rather than viewing others' successes as a reflection of your own inadequacies, see them as sources of inspiration or learning. Ask yourself what specific strategies or strengths they possess that you might incorporate into your own life. This not only transforms comparison into a constructive process, but also reinforces that everyone has a unique path to success. In summary, comparative thinking involves evaluating yourself relative to others, which, when taken to an extreme, can distort your self-perception and lead to negative emotions. It often manifests through upward comparisons that induce feelings of inferiority and downward comparisons that may create complacency. By becoming aware of these patterns, focusing on your personal journey, practicing mindfulness, and reframing your thoughts, you can reduce the negative effects of comparative thinking and foster a more balanced and empowering perspective on your own life. Emotional hijacking occurs when your brain's emotional system takes over before your rational mind has a chance to process what's happening. In these moments, intense emotions such as anger, fear, or sadness surge through you, often overwhelming any logical thought process. It's as if your emotional brain, primarily the amygdala, fires off its alarm signal so quickly that the more deliberate, rational part of your brain, the prefrontal cortex, can't catch up. As a result, you may react impulsively without weighing the consequences of your actions. For example, imagine you receive some unexpected criticism at work. Rather than pausing to consider the feedback objectively, your mind immediately floods with negative emotions. You might feel embarrassed, anxious, or even angry, and then react defensively by lashing out or shutting down communication entirely. These reactions aren't premeditated. They're automatic responses based on a deep-seated, evolutionary wiring that once helped our ancestors react swiftly to physical dangers. Today, however, such rapid responses often lead to misunderstandings, conflicts, or actions that you later regret. In the midst of an emotional hijack, you might notice that you're thinking in black and white terms. A minor setback becomes a catastrophic failure, or a small hurtful comment is interpreted as a sign of deep personal rejection. This overreaction can distort your perception of the situation, causing you to focus solely on the negative without considering any positive aspects or alternative explanations. Over time, if emotional hijacking becomes a habitual response, it can have a cumulative effect on your mental health, contributing to chronic stress, anxiety, or even depression. Emotional hijacking also affects relationships. When you allow your emotions to dominate, you might end up saying things you don't mean or misinterpreting others' actions. For instance, if a friend seems distracted during a conversation, instead of considering that they might be preoccupied or tired, you might assume they're upset with you. This misinterpretation can lead to defensive behavior, distancing yourself from the person, and creating a self-fulfilling prophecy where the relationship begins to suffer simply because of the initial, unverified assumption. The key to managing emotional hijacking lies in developing awareness and strategies to regain control over your emotional responses. One effective approach is to recognize the physical signs of an emotional surge, like a racing heart, sweating, or shallow breathing, and to deliberately pause. Taking a few deep, controlled breaths can help slow down your heart rate and give your prefrontal cortex a chance to re-engage. This pause can create a moment of space between the triggering event and your reaction, allowing you to reflect on the situation more calmly. Another useful strategy is cognitive restructuring, which involves challenging your immediate emotional responses with evidence-based reasoning. Ask yourself questions like, what exactly triggered this reaction? Or, is there another way to interpret this situation? By examining the evidence, you can often uncover that the initial surge of emotion was based on a misinterpretation or an overreaction to the circumstances. For example, if a colleague's brief comment offhandedly seems critical, consider whether it might have simply been a fleeting observation rather than a personal attack. Mindfulness practices also play a crucial role in mitigating emotional hijacking. By training your mind to stay present, you can observe your thoughts and feelings without immediately acting on them. Techniques like meditation or simply taking a mindful pause can help you become more attuned to your internal state, making it easier to recognize when your emotions are starting to spiral out of control. Over time, These practices can help you build resilience, allowing you to navigate stressful situations with a more balanced perspective. Additionally, it can be very helpful to talk about your experiences with a trusted friend or a mental health professional. Discussing what happened can provide external perspective and reassurance, often revealing that the emotional reaction was disproportionate to the actual event. Such conversations not only help validate your feelings, but also offer constructive insights that can prevent similar episodes in the future. In summary, emotional hijacking is a phenomenon where intense emotions overwhelm your rational thinking, leading to impulsive reactions that may not accurately reflect the reality of a situation. This cognitive distortion is driven by your brain's ancient survival mechanisms, which, while useful in the face of physical danger, can be maladaptive in modern social contexts. By developing self-awareness, practicing mindfulness, engaging in cognitive restructuring, and seeking supportive dialogue, you can learn to manage these intense emotional responses. Over time, these strategies can help you regain control, ensuring that your reactions are more balanced and reflective of the true nature of the situation.